Forbidden places you will never visit. Just imagine you're on a fishing boat in the Bay of Bengal. You've had a successful day and it's time to get back to shore, when all of a sudden a typhoon forms right in front of your face over the water. And before you know it, your boat has been flipped and you are essentially lost at sea. Your entire crew is gone and you're holding onto a floating board for dear life. Your energy is low from kicking and screaming, and you pass out, clinging to this board. You wake up later, looking at a clear sky, and you notice you're not in the water anymore. You're on the beach, but you don't know what beach you're at because you weren't near land. You cough up some water and start to sit up when you realize a small bunch of blobs in the distance. You see them approach and you realize that it's people, but not people you've seen before. The closer you get, the more you realize that these people are barely clothed and wielding sticks and bows. Did you time travel? Unfortunately not. You have just washed up on North Sentinel Island. North Sentinel Island is the first location on this list, and it is likely one of the most well-known forbidden places in the entire world. Oh, and as far as the fisherman who washed up on the beach, yeah, his skull is now a pendant for one of the Sentinelese people. North Sentinel Island is one of the Andaman Islands in the Indian archipelago in the Bay of Bengal, which also includes some other smaller islands as well. What makes North Sentinel Island so unique is the fact that it's solely occupied by a voluntarily isolated indigenous tribe, who are believed to have been there for over 60,000 years. These people are known as the Sentinelese, and they have made their wishes known by force, specifically by killing anybody who tries to contact them or even come close. They have made their message so clear that the Indian Navy patrols the area around the North Sentinel Island to protect it from people trying to enter it. And the Indian government does not prosecute any Sentinelese people for killing people that try to step ashore. That's insane that this uncontacted tribe is essentially immune to the law. The Sentinelese have not only attacked people that have stepped on shore, but have also repeatedly attacked approaching vessels, whether those be fishing boats or simply any sort of low-flying helicopter or plane in the range of their bows and arrows. The story I told at the beginning of this segment is actually inspired by real events that took place in 2006. During this time, Sentinelese islanders killed 2 fishermen whose boat drifted ashore. And like the intro story, this approach wasn't even intentional. Although, speaking of intentionally visiting the Sentinelese, in 2018, a 26-year-old man named John Chu, who was an American Christian missionary, tried on 3 separate attempts to visit the North Sentinelese people, likely to convert them to Christianity, but unfortunately on his 3rd trip, which he was successfully able to approach these people, he was unsurprisingly murdered, which is obviously unfortunate. But this young man was warned by the Indian government and other authorities. In 1956, there was an Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes regulation that was put in place that restricted any approach closer than 5 nautical miles, which is essentially anywhere within a 10-kilometer radius of the island. The biggest reason why this regulation was put in place is to protect the Sentinelese people from mainland diseases. Due to the severity of the isolation of North Sentinel Island, they have almost no immunity to any modern-day disease or germ that may be on you or I right now. So if you were to visit North Sentinel Island, there's a very likely chance that even spending time around them, breathing near them, shaking one of their hands, could lead to the death of the entire population of the Sentinelese people simply by spreading germs. North Sentinel Island is a forbidden location that I personally don't intend on breaking any rules to visit. But what if fishing wasn't your speed? Perhaps you are more interested in agriculture, specifically Chinese agriculture. The year is 1974 and you are simply on your farm. And what's a good farm without a well? So you start digging a well. However, this day was different. As you start digging, you notice something that is about to uncover one of the largest excavation projects of all time. And then you go deeper and you notice hardened fragments of terracotta. And then you notice bronze arrowheads and then terracotta bricks. Well, in that case, you just discovered the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first Qin emperor of China. These artifacts were submitted to the government, and shortly after, archaeologists arrived. And although they were curious and interested about the artifacts that may have laid underground, they were not at all prepared for what they were about to find. What they found was a massive necropolis, the size of a small city, with a plethora of artifacts, weapons, vehicles, and most famously, terracotta soldiers. There is estimated to be over 8,000 terracotta soldiers in total, but that actual figure is unknown because this mausoleum is still not fully excavated and may never be. Keep in mind, this excavation has been going on since 1974 and still continues to this day. This mausoleum was built from 246 to 208 BC. The mausoleum mirrored the city of Jianyang with an inner and outer city structure. And although this outer and inner city structure where the terracotta soldiers have been found has began to be excavated, one place that has never been touched was the tomb itself. This tomb is at the very center of the complex, and it is very large. In case the thousands of terracotta soldiers were not enough of a sign, the late Qin Shi Huan did not want people entering his tomb. At least, not without a fight, I guess. So I suppose that begs the question, why did the government keep excavating? Well, the three reasons they listed publicly were the following. One was the fact that this area was a seismic zone, and they needed to remove these historic artifacts to protect them. The next reason was for tourism, to potentially make it something that people could visit and appreciate. And the third reason was to prevent grave robbing, essentially theorizing that if they didn't take it, somebody else would. In case the 8,000 terracotta soldiers didn't make this obvious, this mausoleum is massive. The replica inner city is over 2.5 kilometers in circumference, and the outer city is over 6.3 kilometers in circumference, which is insane for a mausoleum. Even the tomb itself is massive. It's believed to be 80 meters east to west and 50 meters north to south, and 15 meters tall on the inside. However, the interior height is debated. It is a very real possibility that we will never be able to know what's inside the tomb, simply because of limitations in archaeological abilities, specifically the risk of destroying so many other artifacts just to get inside the tomb. But we do have historical accounts of what is said to be inside the tomb, which is the following. The emperor's tomb is surrounded by rivers of liquid mercury, which was the emperor's immortality elixir of choice. Which, just quick side note, yeah, this emperor was literally drinking mercury to try to extend his life, which ironically ended up causing him to go crazy and die. But okay, back to the historical account. There is a domed ceiling representing celestial bodies made from pearls and precious gems. The floor has a design of the entire map of his empire. And besides all of his precious belongings and stunning architecture, there was of course claims of booby traps, specifically crossbow traps that would be activated if anybody tried to enter the tomb, which would result in them, of course, being shot and killed. Here's where things get interesting. These accounts were of course questionable, and archaeologists were suspicious. But after probing the soil near the tomb, it was confirmed that the mercury levels in the soil were 100 times over the normal level, giving some credibility to these historic claims. Which also gives credibility to the fact that there may be booby traps, which has essentially spooked archaeologists, as they believe these traps would be fully functioning, which I personally find hard to believe, but I also wouldn't risk it either. This tomb is listed as a World Heritage Site and is therefore protected by legal entities. But that's not the only reason why you're not able to go here. Unlike North Sentinel Island, which is relatively easy to visit if you have a boat or know somebody with a boat, the tomb of Qin Shi Huan is simply unable to be reached, at least to any regular person with reasonable means. What I mean is, of course, if you hypothetically had a bunch of dynamite, you could blow it up, but obviously that's not realistic. Or is it? No. Unless... Just kidding. Therefore, you're not only not allowed to visit it, you're also not able, making it a perfect entry for this list. Let's hope that you got your sea legs back, because we're hitting the water again. This time, we're going to a remote island intentionally, although it's not off the coast of India. This island is actually in the Arctic Circle. This island is known as Spitsbergen, and it's tucked away in the Arctic Svalbard archipelago. And if you're wondering why we're going here, it's primarily because of your passion for agriculture. Spitsbergen is the home of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and this seed vault is one of the most interesting places in the entire world, and is kind of an interesting take on the Doomsday Vault. In short, it's an ultra-secure facility with the sole purpose of being a safeguard for global crop diversity by storing duplicates of every known seed. This place is really just a sperm bank for plants, or other stuff like that. The Seed Vault is actually a partnership between the Norwegian government and Crop Trust, which is a genetic resource center, which sounds evil, but probably isn't. But it might be. This facility is epic, and if you like brutalist architecture, you are going to love this building. It's essentially a concrete slab sticking out the side of a mountain in the middle of an uninhabited Arctic wasteland. To me, it seems like a pretty cool place to store some stuff. The entire facility goes almost 400 feet into the side of a mountain, and a majority of this facility is kept at negative 18 degrees Celsius, as that is the recommended temperature to store seeds. I guess, I don't know, I'm not a seed expert. One unique failsafe about this facility that I think is pretty cool is the fact that even if all the refrigeration units failed today, the seed vault would still be completely protected because it is stored within permafrost, meaning that it's very well insulated and very cold. Now, if only the people that designed this designed the Death Star too. As of 2022, there is over 1.2 million unique types of seed in this facility. And interestingly, and potentially somewhat obviously, this facility is not manned. It is autonomous, and I suppose that's a good thing considering the fact that it's literally in the middle of nowhere, always kept at deadly temperatures with basically nothing around you. This seed bank is a really unique modern invention that I think serves a genuine purpose that hopefully we will never need, but could very well serve a massive role in the development of humanity if it ever came to it. I think it goes without saying that this seed vault is completely off limits. Not only is it in an extremely remote location in a part of the world that's already hard to navigate and travel to, but the facility itself is extremely secure. So unfortunately, you won't be able to check out the cool seed collection, but that's okay. And you're a person of culture. Modern archives and architecture is cool, but you want history. You want to see some cool stuff and some old stuff. And for that exact reason, we're going to France. The date is September 12th, 1940, and you and your trusty dog are on a walk like any other day. Your dog notices a hole left by an uprooted tree, and you notice something rather interesting, but you don't bother at the moment. You go home and ponder on what you may have saw and decide that you have some unfinished business, and you return to that uprooted tree with 3 of your best friends. You begin digging, a common theme in this video, I suppose, and notice that this uprooted tree has a lot below it. Specifically, a 15-meter deep cave shaft. You and your friends are brave, and you enter the cave and start exploring. And not only do you see some cool stalactites and stalagmites and light brights, but you also see interesting designs on the walls. Those designs were ancient cave paintings depicting animals. This cave is known as Lascaux Cave, and it is a network of caves in southwestern France with over 600 cave paintings found on the interior walls of its caves. It is suggested that these paintings were not made all at once and that they were the combined effort of many generations. And although they haven't been able to quite pinpoint a date for each and every one of these paintings, the general consensus is that these paintings are anywhere from 17 to 22,000 years old, which is so cool. There was an amount of time where this cave was actually open to the public for tours, but over time, due to carbon dioxide, heat, humidity, and other contaminants produced by the 1,200 visitors that visited these caves a day, the paintings were essentially disintegrating and were being visibly damaged. Therefore, the cave was closed to the public in 1963. Since then, the paintings have been restored to their original state and a monitoring system has been put in place. It's actually just a baguette holding a door closed. I don't know, I'm sure they've got something amazing. So yeah, unless you're able to travel at least 70 years into the past, you're not going to be seeing these original 22,000-year-old paintings. However, this story does have a bit of a happy ending, because obviously there was demand for these cave tours, and that wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. So what the authorities actually did was create exact replicas of this cave system for people to explore and visit without any risk of the originals being damaged, which is honestly pretty cool. But what isn't cool is snakes. And since 2 out of the 4 entries on this list so far have been on islands, let's add another one to the list and combine the 2. Snakes in an island. You know what that gets you? You're right. Snake Island. No, not the island boy's haircut. Snake Island is an island, I know. And it is also off the coast of Brazil. The island is famous for, of course, its large population of venomous snakes, specifically the golden lancehead pit viper. And what's interesting is that this island is the only known natural home for this breed of snakes. But there is a bit of mystery surrounding this island. How exactly did these snakes get here, and why is there so many of them? It's not called Snake Island because there's a few. It's called Snake Island because it's only inhabited by snakes, and a lot of them at that. The island is roughly 106 acres in area, and is believed to be the home of around 400,000 snakes, although that number more recently has been debated. But if you ask me, I don't think we're getting an accurate head count anytime soon. Point being, there is a lot of snakes on this island. But the question remains, how did these snakes get here? And I hope you brought your tissues because it's kind of a sad story. Basically, when the Portuguese colonized Brazil, the Portuguese made all of the native Brazilians disown their pet snakes. Obviously outraged, the native Brazilians didn't give up their snakes without a fight, and they banded up all of their snakes and sent them off to sea on a raft, hoping that they would find a better life. After a few days, this raft of about 500,000 snakes washed up ashore on this uninhabited island, and the rest is history. I totally just made all of that up. The real reason why there is so many snakes on this island is much more simple. During the last ice age, this island, which is now 33 kilometers off the coast of Brazil, was actually connected to the mainland. But near the end of the ice age, as water levels started to rise, the snakes essentially became trapped on this island. Their population grew due to a lack of natural predators. Fortunately, these snakes weren't the only animals on the island. There was actually a plethora of ladders. But unfortunately, after a few dangerous games of snakes and ladders, only the snakes remained. I don't know why I'm lying so much in this video, but hopefully you can tell fact from fiction. Sure, there's a lot of snakes on an island, but there's a lot of snakes on a plane too, and people are still on the plane. Why is there not people on this island? Well, similar to North Sentinel Island, Snake Island is off limits to any civilians. The Brazilian Navy claims that this is for the protection of both the snakes and the people that may potentially try to access the island. The only people that are advised to go on the island have to be vetted by the Institute for Biodiversity Conservation, which I'm assuming is no easy task. And if you try to go the other way, well, you'll have to deal with the Brazilian Navy. And similar to North Sentinel Island, if the snakes kill you, the Brazilian Navy is not going to put them in jail. That's crazy that now twice on this list, there is groups of people that are immune to the law simply because they got an island. I wonder if there's any more recent examples of people with islands breaking the law. That's an interesting phenomenon, but let's keep moving. Wait, okay, last thing I'm gonna say about Snake Island. Making fake maps claiming that there is buried treasure on this remote island, when in reality, it's actually just Snake Island, would be a hilarious prank. Not in the modern day, but definitely pirate times, dude. This was a pirate time banger of a prank, guaranteed. You know what? We're on the topic of islands. Last island, one last island for the list. Palette cleanse, we'll go through it quick. Morgan Island. No story, no nothing. Just straight up facts. Morgan Island is also known as Monkey Island, and if you can't guess why it's called that, you may live on Monkey Island. Monkey Island is famous for, of course, its population of free-ranged monkeys. It is completely uninhabited by people, and this island is protected by the Department of Natural Resources and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which use it for public health research, which unfortunately is basically just animal testing. Boo. Monkey Island, unlike Snake Island, is not naturally occurring, and actually has a very odd origin story. To put it bluntly, there was a lot of monkeys in Puerto Rico that were carrying hepatitis B, and it was becoming so much of a problem that there was frequent outbreaks. So what is the most logical and reasonable next step? Well, according to some people in 1979, the best idea was to capture 1,400 monkeys and relocate them to a remote island in South Carolina. And ladies and gentlemen, Morgan Island, aka Monkey Island. So in case you ever wanted to be surrounded by over 1,000 monkeys with hepatitis, Morgan Island definitely needs to be on your travel wish list. But you don't just want to go to remote islands full of uncontacted tribes or a plethora of dangerous animals. And you don't want to go to rural China. And you don't like the cold, so Norway's out too. Well, if that's the case, then I have one last location for you. And if you're a Reddit meme lord, then you're going to be right at home. This last forbidden location takes us to a salt flat in the middle of Nevada. The salt flat is known as Groom Lake. And what makes this salt flat relevant to this video is what's built on the salt flat. That being a Nevada test and training range. But there's military bases everywhere, so what makes this one so special? This test and training range is home to one of the most popular and highly classified United States Air Force bases, most commonly known as Area 51. Interestingly, Area 51 was never considered a secret base. However, it is the home for some of the most secret and sensitive documents that pertain to military intel in the United States. The origin of the name Area 51 is actually unknown. However, according to the CIA, the proper names for the facility are Homey Airport and Groom Lake. The primary initial purpose of Area 51 was a testing ground for Project Aquatone, the development of the Lockheed U-2, which was one of the most iconic spy planes of all time, and still has a lot of mystery surrounding it, almost 70 years later. Since then, this area has gained a lot more popularity, and due to the secrecy surrounding it, there has been no shortage of questions, mysteries, and conspiracy theories surrounding the happenings of this military base. Obviously, with the most famous examples being its affiliation with aliens. I honestly wish I had more to talk about, but facts about this location are kind of hard to come by, and I don't think I need to explain why a military base with sensitive information is off limits. But I do find it kind of interesting that, although this is a perfect entry for this video, it's a bit of a catch-22. Because for any random civilian, Area 51 is a place you will never even get close to. At least, not alive. But for hundreds of people, this is a place they come every single day. It's their job. But that's a different story. In 2019, there was actually a large movement for people with way too much free time to storm Area 51 to get answers and see an alien for themselves. This movement was heavily meme-based, but was still very real. On the night of the actual event, over 1,500 people showed up at the border of Area 51, primarily partying and enjoying the scenery, although some took it more serious than others. At the end of the event, nobody got in. Surprisingly, nobody died, and 7 people were arrested. It was a mostly peaceful meme, but I'm sure when all of this was gaining traction and popularity online, some government employees were definitely starting to sweat a bit. The scariest cults from around the world. Imagine you're standing on the street just minding your own business when you get approached by a couple and they have some important information for you. They tell you that they are spiritual guides and they can help take you to a next level of existence beyond Earth and human comprehension. They say that you can transcend humanity by transforming into an immortal extraterrestrial being. It sounds like an interesting proposal. So you take a flyer and attend a meeting, and at this point, you can go either one of two ways. Your suspicions are either confirmed and you realize that you spoke to crazy people, or you believed you talked to some of the most important people ever, and in that instance, you just joined a cult. This cult is known as Heaven's Gate, and it was an American cult founded in 1974 by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who, like I mentioned, saw themselves as spiritual guides to a next level of human existence. Without spoiling the ending, Heaven's Gate is most commonly known for its mass suicides committed by its members, but the story goes a lot deeper than just the headlines. Nettles and Applewhite first met in 1972 and went on a journey of spiritual discovery together, and came out on the other side identifying themselves as 2 witnesses of Revelation, or the Book of Apocalypse in the Bible. This claim alone, and some clever convincing, was reason enough for them to start attracting hundreds of people to start at least paying attention to their movement in the mid-70s. And after a few years, they even had over a dozen members adopting a monastic lifestyle, dedicating their life to Heaven's Gate, and giving up all worldly pursuits beyond this cult, which is insane. This cult is commonly recognized as a UFO religion, primarily because the central belief of this group was that the followers could transform themselves into immortal extraterrestrial beings by rejecting their human nature. By rejecting this human nature, they would, by default, ascend to heaven, or what they would refer to as the next level. This cult primarily grew by Applewhite and Nettles trying to contact other extraterrestrials, aka like-minded people, aka other crazy people. They took out ads and flyers to promote meetings where they would recruit disciples that they called the crew. At these events, they would purport to represent beings from another planet who were looking for patients for an experiment. That alone is already creepy. They got straight to the crazy even on sign up. There was no easing into it, it seemed. They mentioned, though, that those who agreed to take part in their experiment would be brought to a higher evolutionary level. An interesting proposal, potentially, but still, red flags are everywhere. In 1975, Applewhite and Nettles preached at a motel hall in Oregon, and following that session, over 20 people sold all of their worldly possessions and essentially disappeared off the face of the planet, not being seen by family, friends, or even the general public at all. These people didn't just disappear, but they had become a part of Heaven's Gate, which at this point had already began going underground. Applewhite and Nettles changed their name to Doe and T, and they had led nearly 100 people across the country to ditch their families and join Heaven's Gate. The lore that they came up with is deep, and it's a really weird twist on a lot of existing religious texts and theories about history. But one of the more interesting claims they made is that they believed that Jesus himself was an alien, which is an interesting take for sure. But what's more interesting is what happened in October of 1996. The group rented a large house that they called the Monastery, which was a 10,000 square foot mansion in California. At the time, they were paying $7,000 per month in rent, cash, and they even took out alien abduction insurance on each of their members, with a $1 million payout per person. Which, who the hell is selling alien abduction insurance? But that's a side point. That's a video about insurance scams, not cults. Now, this house isn't the interesting event, but it's the precursor to what really put this cult on the map. Nearly 1 year into renting the monastery, Applewhite taped a video of himself entitled Doe's Final Exit, where he spoke on mass death and how it was the only way to evacuate this Earth. He was convinced that the comet Hale-Bopp was the sign that the group had been looking for, and speculated that there was a UFO following this comet. And because of this, Applewhite and 38 of his followers prepared a ritual death. This death lined up exactly with when the comet was closest to the Earth, so that their souls could reach the next level. In the following days, 39 people had taken a concoction of vodka and poison, and, like you may have guessed, died. There is so much crazy and honestly disturbing lore to this cult, but I think the best way to describe it is that they believe that humans were boring, aliens were cool, and if a human wanted to become an alien, they had to die. It's amazing what people are willing to believe and dedicate and sacrifice their life for. Oh, and if the Heaven's Gate logo looks familiar, Lil Uzi Vert used it as inspiration for his album cover, which is odd. But assuming you're a semi-reasonable person, you're likely not interested or swayed by the claims of an afterlife and UFOs and being a part of the Bible from random strangers. What a reasonable person may be interested in, though, is a community that worships God, people that are like-minded in faith, a faith that at surface level seems semi-reasonable. In this instance, you may be interested in the Children of God. This name already may sound familiar, and that's because Nick Crowley, a great YouTuber, just made a video about some of the lore involved with this cult. Specifically, the TV programs this cult was producing, which was insane. It was essentially propaganda pieces for children. And spoiler alert, it was pretty disturbing. But we'll get to that. The Children of God lore is deep, and I'll do my best to summarize it as neatly as possible. The Children of God was founded by a creep named David Berg in 1968. It initially attracted young followers with the message of love, communal living, and devotion, which may sound innocent enough. But the group soon became infamous for its controversial beliefs and practices. Most of these controversial beliefs and practices started to be introduced once the cult was more established. Initially, some of their beliefs were more conservative and aligned with the Bible, although it seemed that the group's beliefs started to morph to fit Berg's personal desires, which we'll get into. For example, initially the group was rather conservative and didn't even believe in hand-holding until marriage. But once Berg had an affair with his assistant, he then started spreading messages of polygamy, which turned into what he called sharing, which we'll get into, and that gets a lot darker. Before we get too into the weeds, let's give some context. This group was founded with a core focus on an apocalyptic prophecy, where Berg was claiming that the world was set to end in 1993. And the purpose of this group was to promote love and devotion to God so that they could be saved during this apocalypse. They spread their messages through song and dedicated as much time as possible to praising God before the end times. Child members of this group were not even educated because they saw it as a waste of time because the world was ending soon anyway. So all of the children and adults in this group were simply sitting, hanging out, singing songs, waiting for the end of the world, which to me doesn't sound like a great time. But that's just me. Floor Edwards, a previous member of the Children of God, said this about the cult's mindset at the time. Quote, "For many, it was euphoric thinking about the afterlife. We earned that spot in heaven. We were the chosen ones." That's definitely a take on it. Interestingly, Berg wasn't seen very often by most of the cult members, as at its peak, the group had over 10,000 members worldwide. Although he was in consistent communication with all of his followers through what he called Mo letters, which was essentially daily propaganda pieces, where he would take Bible verses and intertwine them with his own twisted doctrine, which, like I mentioned earlier, evolved over time. These Mo letters included instructions that his followers must follow, and strangely enough, a lot of the imagery in these letters was rather graphic. We'll say that. According to ex-members of the Children of God, Mo wrote over 3,000 of these Mo letters, which is insane. But these letters weren't the only way that the Children of God was able to get their message out. Like I mentioned, Nick Crowley made a great video about the TV series that the Children of God had created and that was televised called Life with Grandpa, in which he describes the TV show essentially indoctrinating children into the values of the group and the religious beliefs that were unsavory, to say the least. To really paint the picture, there's a scene in the show where a woman is shown as a robot with literal boobs, and Grandpa, aka David Berg, was talking about how much he loves this perfect woman. And there's many episodes with young girls singing about how their purpose is to cook, clean, and take care of the men in their life. That is honestly just a tame sampling of some of the cool stuff in this cult's kid show. Of course, I'm using cool ironically. Now, going back to the concept of sharing. Without getting too graphic, essentially, Berg was promoting love with no bounds, as he claimed that Jesus created love and sex for people to enjoy, and he thought the best way to honor God was to have it without limits, which to him meant with anybody at any time, consenting or not, which also included with children, which is obviously disgusting. Former members who were children at the time said that they felt pressured to do anything with anyone because they knew if they said no that they would be punished by God and potentially not accepted into heaven when the apocalypse came, which was, in their mind, soon. This, unsurprisingly, led to widespread allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse, of course, including minors. The Children of God faced significant backlash and legal scrutiny due to the reports of emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse among members, although that wasn't quite enough to take it down fully. That was the bump in the road for the group. After David Berg died, his assistant, who he was having the affairs with, took over the group and tried rebranding the group multiple times in an attempt to distance it from its dark past. And they even tried to renounce some of their harmful practices. However, the decades of trauma experienced by former members was an inseparable part of the cult's history. And with the death of David, the rebrands, and all of the allegations, the group went from over 10,000 members worldwide to today being a small underground internet community. And I personally hope it continues to shrink to the point of nothingness very soon. I'm sure the world not ending in 1993 also had a big part to do with it. Interestingly, multiple celebrities were actually involved with this cult, notably Joaquin Phoenix and Rose McGowan. Rose McGowan described her experience as extremely stressful, like she was walking a high-wire act. She was expected to be perfect physically and was even cut with a knife by another member when she had a blemish on her finger. How Rose was involved in this group was because her father was actually the leader of the Italian branch of the Children of God. But fortunately, once the Children of God started promoting child abuse, her dad separated from the group entirely. Joaquin Phoenix and his siblings in the 1970s were also involved in the group, and even traveled through Central and South America with the group, but didn't remain members for long, as initially they thought it was a dedicated religious group, but found out that it was much deeper than that and cut ties. It's upsetting enough when individuals are tricked into joining cults and doing unspeakable things and having horrible lives, but it's just downright disheartening and depressing when they get their children involved too. Likely unsurprisingly, the Children of God had a extremely high rate, with many ex-members having lifelong trauma, psychological illnesses, and at the very least, horrible, unforgettable memories. But if you're not interested in aliens, and you're not interested in any sort of religious movement, what if a man approached you and told you that he could tell you when you're going to die? This, to anybody, may seem like an interesting proposal, but the more info you start to get, the more the cracks start to show. This man referred to himself as Lou Castor and claimed that he was 1,000 years old and he was the combination of 3 different angels. He claimed that he had died and came back to life and that now he himself can predict deaths accurately, among other things. Potentially one of the biggest draws for some is that Lou claimed that if you were close to him, he could not only predict your death, but bring you back to life, which for most people sounds like a good reason to stick around. But on top of the claims of being resurrected, from a surface level, it looked like the members of this group lived a relatively lavish lifestyle. Lou had a compound in Wichita, Kansas, where he had 10 members of the group living with him. Everybody who was completely provided for with food, shelter, technology, toys, gadgets, ATVs, luxury vehicles, anything these members could want, they had, and it was all provided for by Lou. But interestingly enough, nobody knew what Lou did for work. He said he had stocks and bonds and a cattle ranch down in Texas, but nobody could directly pinpoint his wealth, and it didn't seem like anybody was extremely concerned because they were directly benefiting from it, although it definitely came with a price. Having a 10-person commune with luxury vehicles in Wichita, Kansas definitely drew attention, but for this cult, that wasn't an issue. And Lou was an active participant in the community. He would donate to the police, have community-wide barbecues in his backyard, and even had an ATV track on his 10-acre property where anybody could come and enjoy the track. This sense of community definitely allowed people to feel a little bit more comfortable, and I think people assumed that if he had something to hide, he wouldn't be so flashy, which may seem reasonable, but you could also say this is more or less of a John Wayne Gacy approach. But here's the thing. Behind closed doors, unspeakable things were happening, and although on the surface it seemed like an outgoing, luxury lifestyle of cool people just having fun, it was really anything but that once you got to the core of the group. When Angel's Landing went from Texas to Wichita, Kansas, they actually gained 3 new members: Lou's real estate agent and 2 young daughters. This real estate agent sold Lou the property, and upon meeting him, she felt very compelled to not only be close to him, but protect him. And he shortly after confessed to her that he was an angel. Because of this information, this real estate agent uprooted herself and her 2 young daughters from Missouri to Wichita, Kansas to join the commune, leaving her husband and her children's father behind. I'm assuming you can guess where this is going, and it ended up with Lou assaulting and abusing both of these young girls. But not only that, combining it with mental manipulation to make them feel like it was almost normal, which it obviously wasn't at all. In 2003, the story got a lot more publicized, as one of the members living in the commune had passed away. This member had seemingly fallen, hit their head, and then fell into the pool, which caused them to drown and die, which obviously got a lot of attention but wasn't necessarily considered suspicious, at least not legally. The death aligned with most accidental drowning deaths and was not considered for having any foul play, although that didn't mean that there wasn't any questions stirring about this commune within the community. At this time, unbeknownst to Lou and the rest of the commune, the police were actually closely monitoring the commune, but not for the reasons you may have thought. They were being monitored by the narcotics department because Lou had unexplained wealth, and their assumption was that there was an illegal drug operation or something along those lines funding this 10-acre ranch with seemingly unlimited money. And with the news breaking of this death on the property, some members in the community had their own questions as well. This member that they lost was considered to be the mother of the group, and she was Lou's right-hand woman. And it was a tragic loss within the group and outside of the group, as she was somebody that people looked up to and at least had a positive relationship with publicly. Following the death of the member who passed away in the pool, the other members of the group were waiting for Lou to bring her back, as he claimed that this was an ability of his. And after some time passed, Lou changed his story and claimed that he doesn't want to bring Patricia back. Lou claimed that where Patricia is now is much better than where we are, and that our goal is to meet her where she's at and not to bring her back here. And I suppose that was a satisfactory response to some of the members. And although the death was ruled as accidental, the FBI was interested, to say the least. They began looking into a Lou Castro and realized that there is no record of this person existing. No documents, no birth certificate, no driver's license. They were dealing with a ghost, until they found one piece of information referencing the name. This was an obituary for a woman he used to live with in a previous smaller commune. This woman had passed away with her new boyfriend and daughter during a leisure flight, and unfortunately, shortly after takeoff, this entire group passed away. It's an interesting side note, but Lou was previously a plane mechanic. That, again, was ruled as an accidental death. But the coincidences are starting to kind of fall apart here. 3 years after the death of the woman in the pool, her husband, another member of Angel's Landing, was killed as well. He was working on his car and laying underneath a vehicle when his jack failed, crushing and killing him. The unfortunate and tragic death of this second member of Angel's Landing was a pivotal moment in discovering the truth. Like I mentioned, the Angel's Landing group was already under investigation secretly by the FBI and local authorities. But once 2 accidental deaths took place within 3 years, they cranked up their search and began looking at alternative means of information. And one thing they found that cracked this case wide open was the insurance payouts on these group members. Both Patricia, the woman who died in the pool, and her husband, who died under the car years later, had large life insurance policies, both of which specifically paying out to the Angel's Landing group, which was 100% controlled by Lou Castro. Each of these policies paid out over $1.2 million. And suddenly, things are starting to make a lot of sense. Somebody who's able to predict deaths and then have them magically happen, somebody who has accidental deaths magically follow him around, and somebody who has an unexplainable amount of wealth, but no source of income. All now starts to make a lot more sense when you realize that there may be some foul play going on here. But in case that's not enough to make you convinced that there was something really strange going on to this cult, 2 years after the husband of the initial woman who died passed away, there was a third death within the group. It was the death of the real estate agent who moved into the commune to protect him. This same woman that had 2 young daughters in the group. Lou got her 2 young daughters together and told them that it was her mother's time and that she was going to die shortly. Obviously, they were extremely upset and didn't want to believe it, and they told their mom. And their mom didn't seem too fazed and reassured them that she wasn't going anywhere and that she was going to be fine. But unfortunately, 2 days later, she passed away in a horrible car accident. And at that point, detectives were no longer allowing this to go on anymore. Once again, a life insurance payout was due to hit Lou's account any day. And coincidentally, the previous balance was getting pretty low from the last payout. It's almost like this was how he was funding his lifestyle. At this point, detectives were just going to his property and had a unique plan to collect fingerprints to try to get more information. They knocked on Lou's door and they told him that they were looking for information on local criminals and had pictures of criminals that they wanted him to potentially identify. The detectives entered his home and were starting to show him pictures, hoping to get fingerprints on the photographs, but they noticed that Lou was only grabbing these photos with his fingernails, meaning that he knew what was going on and that they were not going to get any fingerprints. Eventually, they were able to get him on charges of bank fraud, but realized that they needed to get him on these murders if they wanted him to serve any substantial time. And at this point, the stars almost aligned, because the eldest of the 2 young girls who were a part of this group at this point was an adult, and had met a man who shortly became her boyfriend. Not long into dating, they had a moment and she opened up to him about everything. And that night when she went to bed, he went to the FBI website and informed them about everything that was going on in this strange cult in Wichita. Surprisingly, they were quick to respond, collected her statement, and began a full-blown investigation on all of these claims. At this point, they were able to speak to the younger daughter as well, where they were able to collect all the information they needed to put this man away for a serious amount of time. During this Lou person's trial, it was revealed that his name isn't Lou at all, and that was only one of his many aliases, and that his name is Daniel Perez, and he has an extensive history of sexual abuse and much more. And the result of this trial happened in 2015, when Daniel Perez, aka Lou Castro, was sentenced with 80 years in prison. Unfortunately, all of the deaths involving Angel's Landing were still ruled accidental, but they did have a strong enough case through all of the other crimes to put him away for the rest of his life. Okay, I know this is a cult video and not a true crime video, but for Angel's Landing specifically, the beliefs were rather simple. And it wasn't even super religious, honestly. This mysterious, wealthy man just claimed that he was an angel and could predict deaths and save people near him if they did die. And he also required intimacy with children to maintain his powers. Although in reality, he was just a pedophile who was killing his own cult members for insurance payouts to fund his lifestyle. So the religious beliefs are simple, but the lore of the actual story is insane. And I thought you guys would appreciate this twisted story. I know we focused on a lot of mind-bending, twisted, pseudo-religious, disgusting beliefs, so I wanted to kind of focus on the reality of the life in these cults in this story. But the more research I did, the more invested I got in this story. And well, here we go. Before we get into the last cult of this video, I just want to say that it is the unfortunate reality that there is so many crazy and scary cults that have existed and still exist to this day. And although I hand-selected a few for this first video, I do have a sizable number of other cults I do want to discuss, although I didn't want to make this video extremely long in case it wasn't something you guys were interested in, because I haven't really discussed cults on the channel before. So if you guys are interested about more scary and truly disturbing cults, let me know in the comments or leave this video a like. This sort of engagement helps me understand what videos you guys actually want to see. But with that, let's get into our final cult, of this video at least. Let's say that you have absolutely no interest in any sort of religious group at all. Let's just say that you're interested in history, and let's say that maybe you found a particular interest with the Knights Templar, the Catholic military group tasked with protecting the Holy Grail. Perhaps that's an area of interest for you. Well, what if you were approached by some individuals who claimed to be the descendants of that military group and claimed to hold their ideals and then some? You may be interested in hearing them out. And what if these people claimed to you that not only were they the descendants of the Knights Templar, but one of the members was also the reincarnation of Moses from the Bible and King Tut's dad? At that point, you're likely gone, but let's say you're still a little interested. But here's the catch. Even if you're potentially interested in hearing them out, you have to be approved. Specifically through a sizable donation, as this cult is a pretty elitist group, with a group size at its peak of only around 300 to 400 members. So unless you were really wealthy, you weren't even able to hear them out, because they believed that only the richest were even worthy of hearing their message. This was the message of the Order of the Solar Temple, a Neo-Templar movement and a cult. This group had members in Canada, Switzerland, and France. One of the founders of this cult actually had a child with another cult member and believed that this child was a perfect child and that it was a higher being, and that any children that were to happen within the cult would be higher beings as well too, to help his daughter on her purpose. The cult grew and grew, and over time there was a lot of mismanagement happening between the two founders who didn't speak much about the direction of the cult. One leader was focusing on the inner workings of the cult, specifically the meditations, ceremonies, and day-to-day management, and the other leader was focused on the recruitment process, essentially running seminars and spreading the message of their special little group. Because this cult required very significant financial backing, members started to become uneasy on where their money was going, as the cult seemed to have not been growing as much as it once was. And this perfect higher level baby was now a teenager, and she was starting to rebel against her own father as well. And in 1991, one of the ex-members actually sued the group, which definitely started to show the writing on the wall for this elitist cult. And the next year, in 1992, one of the cult leaders was actually arrested for trying to buy illegal firearms in Canada, which is some unfortunate foreshadowing for what's about to happen. Later that year, people were becoming more and more restless, as not only were they unsure about where their money was going, but at this point there were so many unfulfilled spiritual promises that people were starting to not believe any of the claims of these cult leaders. This is where things get dark. As the cult was beginning to crumble and they were losing members and backing, they felt that they needed to figure out something quick, and they decided that they needed to have a transition within their movement. This was a transition to another world. At this point, they began to prepare themselves and certain high-ranking people within the Solar Temple that they believed would be highly favored in this new world, aka people that they probably thought they could manipulate. While they were prepping their members about how to transition into this new world, they were also planning how they would get revenge for those who they felt betrayed them, aka people who saw through the lies and left. The spree of this cult's revenge, starting with highly ranking cult members showing up at the door of previous cult members and stabbing their 5-month-old baby in the heart, as the leader of the Solar Temple claimed that this baby was the Antichrist, when in reality, the parents of this baby, who were also murdered in this horrific event, were simply people who didn't listen to the Solar Temple's demands, which were that they didn't get married and didn't have this baby because it wasn't what the higher beings wanted. It was essentially a power struggle that these former members were no longer interested in playing into. After this horrific murder, there was other instances of strange murder suicides until one of the most insane events associated with this cult happened. On the 5th of October in 1994, 23 people were found dead in a burning chalet in Switzerland. Their bodies were arranged in a circle, and they were all wearing ceremonial robes. After this mass death event, which was more murder than suicide, as most of the participants in this group didn't realize that they were going to be killed and left in a building that would be set on fire. Regardless, in total, 74 people died over the course of the multiple murders and mass murder suicides that happened because of the order of the Solar Temple. And it's not even known how many of these deaths were suicides and how many of these deaths were murders. Because the founders of this cult were killed in these rituals and any of the remaining members went into hiding, the authorities were stumped at what to do because there was nobody to charge and not much that they could do, as most of the participants were gone as well. The result was an extremely strengthened anti-cult movement in Europe, specifically in Francophone Europe. As this event was extremely publicized, the word was finally out about the danger that can be caused by cults. I suppose the one true silver lining about cults is the fact that they always seem to be self-imploding, although even a few moments of existence for the cults that I mentioned today are longer than they should have ever existed. None of these people needed to be hurt, psychologically damaged, abused, assaulted, or killed. And if anything, I hope this video shines a small light on the terrifying world of cults, manipulation, and abuse that's possible. If you enjoyed this video about the scariest cults from around the world, feel free to check out this video about the scariest drugs you've never heard of. We actually have a full 4-part series on this topic, and it's really interesting. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, trust me, bro. Terrifying mental disorders you've never heard of. Cotard syndrome. During the late 1880s, French neurologist Jules Cotard had a very peculiar experience with one of his patients. Her name was Mademoiselle X, and she came to the neurologist claiming that she didn't need to eat anymore. She said this because she believed that she was dead. For some reason, this patient was fully convinced that she had no stomach, no chest, no blood, and no brain. And she knew for a fact that she simply wasn't alive and was not able to die. She told Cotard that she must have been condemned to eternal damnation, and for that reason she cannot possibly die a natural death. As if she could have, she would have died already, as her organs were rotting and she didn't have any blood. And because this patient believed that she had no internal organs, she simply stopped eating as there was no need to, and unsurprisingly, she later died of starvation. This interaction that Jules Cotard had experienced with this patient definitely left an imprint on him and forced him to document everything that this patient was saying and every symptom that they were having. Through this study, he coined the term Cotard syndrome and described the condition as the delusion of negation, stating that it was a psychiatric syndrome that varied in severity. He claimed that mild cases were characterized by despair and self-loathing, while severe cases were characterized by intense delusions of negation and chronic psychiatric depression. Now, although this sounds like an odd one-off story that happened almost 200 years ago, that's not at all the case, and this syndrome still exists today. And while it is extremely rare, there are still people suffering from this syndrome around the world. Cotard syndrome is also known as the walking corpse syndrome. The main symptom of having Cotard syndrome is having a strong belief that you are dead. Many people with this condition simply believe that their internal organs are rotting, or that those organs are missing altogether and they are just existing existing but not alive. A statistical analysis of people suffering from this study showed that 55% of patients with Cotard syndrome believed that they were immortal due to this condition, while the other 45% denied their own existence, claiming that they did not exist, which is definitely a hard sell when you're the one explaining you don't exist. Cotard syndrome is relatively simple to understand, but I'm sure for its patients it's an extremely terrifying experience. Just imagine being fully convinced that you're either missing organs or having organs that are rotting away, or just simply believing that you are somehow dead. It's almost mind-bending trying to even comprehend the mindset in the first place, so I couldn't even imagine how confusing it is to be experiencing that as a reality. Most of the people experiencing these delusions typically end up neglecting their personal care, refusing to eat, clean themselves, sleep, use the washroom, and also may experience self-harming behaviors, all because that they believe there is no reason to maintain a body that they literally consider to be lifeless. To this day, very little is known about this syndrome, but it is still associated with severe depression, schizophrenia, and other neurological issues such as brain lesions. Cotard syndrome is a very peculiar mental condition, but for this list, it's only the tip of the iceberg, and we're just getting into some of the most terrifying and rare mental conditions. Koro. I want you to be honest. Have you ever looked down and thought, dang, my little bro must be shrinking. It was never this small. Well, in that case, you might be suffering from Koro. Honestly, I don't even know where to begin with it. It's also known as genital retraction syndrome or shrinking penis disease, both of which definitely give an odd foundation, and both of which are actually not even fully accurate. And while Koro is a syndrome that does occur worldwide, it is considered a cultural bound delusion, essentially meaning that the symptoms of this delusion are only recognized in specific societies and cultures. Patients suffering with Koro experience overwhelming and intense beliefs that their sexual organs are retracting, and while this literally isn't happening, these people suffering from this disease will go to extreme lengths to prevent this shrinkage from happening. Most people suffering from this condition typically begin by reporting anxiety attacks due to their perceived lack of genitalia, and this perceived shrinkage will be a huge cause of stress for the individual suffering from Koro. And if you're a woman, don't think you're safe from Koro, because there are women who experience Koro, but obviously they aren't experiencing their penis shrinking. They believe that their nipples are retracting and that their breasts are also retracting into their bodies, slowly shrinking. There are cases in which patients experiencing Koro symptoms will have these symptoms for years, and at that point it will be considered chronic. And to doctors, that is an indication of a potential comorbidity with body dysmorphic disorder, also known as BDD. Interestingly, a lot of people experiencing Koro also experience an intense anxiety or fear of impending death, essentially meaning that these people believe that their genitals will shrink so small that they are literally going to die. And this specific belief has a strong cultural link to traditional Chinese beliefs. This sounds kind of silly and obviously odd, but the delusions that these patients are experiencing are nothing funny and truly terrifying. This delusion can cause extreme anxiety, panic, compulsive behaviors, and even habits such as genital stretching to prevent this perceived shrinkage or retraction. The cause for this delusion isn't fully clear, but it is believed to be primarily fueled by cultural beliefs and stress. Now, like I mentioned, if you are experiencing Koro, you aren't actually experiencing any sort of shrinkage of any of your body parts, but what's interesting is that there is a bit of a devious feedback loop that you are getting. Typically, when people are experiencing a Koro attack, they will experience vasoconstriction, which will actually cause their genitals to temporarily shrink a little bit. This actually affirms their delusion and causes a very vicious cycle until the delusion is so strong that it is simply a core belief. And while this vasoconstriction is only temporary, when you are believing such a odd delusion, you are not necessarily thinking logically about this. And even when presented with the fact, it is still hard to come to the conclusion that you are not shrinking. Depending on what culture you're a part of when you are experiencing this Koro, the treatments may differ. In traditional Chinese medicine, typically the remedy that is recommended is a herbal tincture that is applied to your genitals. While in some African cultures, people experiencing Koro will be prescribed a weight to attach to their genitals to help stretch it, to of course maintain its size. Neither of these remedies sound particularly pleasant, and this entire affliction, while silly seeming, is definitely rare. It is a bit unfortunate that your body is almost unwillingly feeding into your delusion by shrinking your junk during these times of panic, unintentionally feeding your delusion more and more. However, typically instances of Koro are not lifelong. Although we may be able to get a chuckle out of it, it's definitely something I would never want to experience. So yeah, Koro literally has men believing that their penis is shrinking and it's gonna get so small that they are literally going to die. And it's still only the second entry on this list. Let's keep going. Body integrity identity disorder. Body integrity identity disorder, also known as BIID, is a condition that I felt made a lot of sense to put here because it kind of relates to the last one, although it's not fully the same. People who are experiencing Koro disorder believe that one of their appendages is shrinking and they are trying to maintain it, whereas people with BIID experience essentially a disassociation from one of their limbs. What this means is that people experiencing this condition essentially don't want either part or one or multiple of their limbs because to them it just doesn't feel like it's theirs. To try to understand how these people are feeling, people with BIID have described it as imagining that you are growing a new limb. That would feel unnatural and you obviously wouldn't want that there. That's how people with BIID feel about their natural born limbs. And people experiencing this condition typically go to extreme lengths to essentially feel normal, typically by seeking amputation for the perfectly healthy limb. Some patients with severe cases of this disorder even wish and desire to become paraplegic. This condition is extremely rare and also uncommonly studied, meaning that there is not much known about it, besides the fact that it blurs the lines between psychiatry and neurology. And for most people suffering from BIID, treatment specifically focuses on understanding the underlying cause for this deep desire. And like I mentioned, for some, does result in amputation. Imagine how you would feel if you felt like there was a part of your body that simply was alien to you, and with nobody to relate to or to be able to give you any sort of answers, it must be a lonely and heartbreaking experience. One thing that came to mind when researching this specific disorder was that one episode of Dr. Phil when that lady poured, I believe it was like drain cleaner in her eyes to make herself permanently blind because she just wanted to be blind. I'm not sure if she was suffering specifically from BIID, but it definitely seems like she was suffering similar symptoms and obviously didn't feel like she was supposed to have the ability to see. But speaking of these limbs feeling alien, let's discuss the next mental disorder. Alien hand syndrome. Alien hand syndrome varies pretty drastically from BIID in one major way. People experiencing alien hand syndrome don't feel like their hand isn't supposed to be part of their body. Their hand simply doesn't act in accordance to their will, almost as if their hand was a sentient being or acting on its own will or potentially an alien limb to your body. Patients experiencing alien hand syndrome typically experience symptoms in their left hand, and what this hand does typically varies depending on the severity of the situation. In 1908, when alien hand syndrome was first discovered, a 57-year-old woman was actually attacked by her alien hand, with this hand consistently smacking and trying to choke the woman, and she had to fight for her life to prevent her rogue limb from killing her. And while this example is extreme and obviously terrifying, it's not the norm, although it isn't uncommon for this rogue limb to do things that you likely wouldn't want them to. Like undressing yourself in public, or simply spilling food or drink, or simply dropping things for no apparent reason. Interestingly, while the first case was reported in 1908, the number of cases actually increased in the 1940s onward when a specific surgery for epilepsy began to become more popular. The specific epilepsy surgery that was correlated with alien hand syndrome was a surgery that essentially disconnected both sides of the brain, cutting the corpus callosum down the center of the brain. The corpus callosum is essentially a bridge of nerves that connects the left brain to the right brain. And disconnecting them, although effective for epilepsy, had consequences. And while that specific epilepsy treatment isn't the only cause for alien hand syndrome, it was definitely one of the most prominent initially. However, with more recent research, it has been discovered that people with medial frontal cortex or parietal lobe damage can also suffer from an alien hand. Although, depending on the area of your brain that was damaged, you will get a different type of alien hand syndrome, which is interesting and also pretty scary. Which I suppose makes sense, but definitely doesn't make it any less scary. People who had their medial frontal cortex damaged typically experience their alien hand being mischievous, with the most common symptoms being impulsive groping and the reluctance to let go of anything. With damage to your corpus callosum, typically you experience your hands literally fighting each other, which I can only imagine is a very unpleasant and scary experience. Now, somewhat differently, people with damage to their parietal lobe experience this condition a bit differently, as they not only don't have control over this arm and have it kind of do whatever it wants, they also feel estranged from this limb. Similar, but not to the same extent that people with BIID experience. But just imagine that. Not only do you feel like this limb that is on your natural body doesn't belong to you, but but also not even being able to control it. It simply is there, part of you, but it kind of has a mind of its own. That is undeniably terrifying. Currently, the direct cause for why this happens in the brain is unknown, and unfortunately, there isn't a cure either. One of the most popular treatments is pretty simple and basically just involves making your alien hand hold on to an object consistently to give it something to do, essentially. I think being born with this condition, you could likely learn to adapt to it relatively quickly and it could be part of normal life. But I think one of the most terrifying parts about this disease is that it's typically developed later in life, meaning that you can live a totally normal life having control of both of your arms. And by getting brain damage in one way or another, not only can you lose control of one of your limbs, but you can literally lose control of one of your limbs. Like, this limb isn't just paralyzed. It is doing things without your consent. It has a mind of its own. And depending on the severity of what this hand is doing, you may have a violent appendage attached to your body with its sights aimed at you. Alice in Wonderland syndrome. Alice in Wonderland syndrome is a neurological disorder that distorts your perception. Typically, this distortion is experienced visually, and these visual distortions are perceived by objects either appearing larger than they are, or smaller than they are, or closer than they are, or potentially even farther than they are. And as you may be able to assume, this is extremely debilitating. These are only a few of the over 60 symptoms associated with Alice in Wonderland syndrome. The Alice in Wonderland books and movies are interesting and fun and whimsical, but when that sort of psychedelic experience is your consistent reality, it becomes a lot less appealing. And for patients suffering with this condition, they can experience not only visual, but also auditory, touch, and time perception issues. It's important to note that these aren't necessarily hallucinations. They're simply a misinterpretation of real things that are happening for a reason that is not fully understood. All that is known about Alice in Wonderland syndrome is that it's currently associated with migraines, head trauma, and EBV, Epstein-Barr virus. In most cases, patients don't experience symptoms consistently, but rather in series of attacks where suddenly almost everything in their reality changes. Just imagine you're sitting on the couch watching TV when all of a sudden the TV that you're looking at becomes 5 times bigger and the room that you're in becomes 10 times smaller, and all of a sudden all you hear is ringing and people talking, and it feels like time's moving really slow and then really fast, and everything's consistently changing, and you have almost no ground, no basis of reality, and you can't trust what you're seeing, hearing, smelling, or touching, and all you can simply do is wait it out. But this wait itself can seem endless with the perception of time being so distorted. However, as disorienting and terrifying as this experience may sound, this disease is pretty understudied and currently isn't considered a neurological disorder or a psychiatric illness, and is kind of just in this medical gray area. And currently there isn't even a known number of how many people are experiencing this mental condition to begin with. A reason for why it's low priority to be researched is because it's not considered to be dangerous, which I suppose is a nice benefit. However, 15% of people that do experience this condition have their attack almost instantly followed up with a migraine, which definitely adds insult to injury. And in that case, there is at least pain associated with this disorienting experience. This condition has been seen in both adults and children, but is most commonly seen in children. And while its cause is unknown, during studies of people who have been actively having these attacks, there is abnormal amounts of electrical activity taking place inside the patient's brain, resulting in an abnormal amount of blood flow to certain parts of the brain that process visual perception and texture. Regardless, even with the lack of classification and little known information about this disease, to me, the experience of Alice in Wonderland syndrome does sound terrifying and extremely unfortunate for those who suffer essentially in silence with almost no answers. It almost sounds like a random bad trip that you don't consent to and can happen at almost any time. Something I wouldn't wish on anybody. But we do still have one more entry to discuss. And quickly, before we get to this final entry on the list, I did want to mention, there was at least another 10 or 15 entries that I researched and wanted to put in this video that I simply had to cut for time, because we post videos every Friday. So with that, if you guys liked this video about rare and terrifying mental disorders, please let me know if you guys would like a part 2. I've got plenty more to talk about, and I'd also love to hear if you guys have any recommendations in the comments below. That being said, let's get to the final entry on this list. Capgras delusion. There's no doubt that every entry on this list in one way or another has been upsetting, disheartening, terrifying, and of course, obscure. But I saved this entry for last because I believe it to be one of likely the most upsetting and depressing entries on this list. But the belief that patients suffering from this delusion believe is extremely disheartening. Those suffering from Capgras delusion believe that someone close to them, typically a loved one, has been replaced by an identical imposter. And in some cases, they even believe that this imposter is going to do them harm. Unsurprisingly, Capgras delusions are typically associated with people experiencing paranoid schizophrenia, but these delusions are also present in people with dementia, brain tumors, and brain injuries. How this works is when you see another human's face, your eyes send a signal to the occipital cortex in your brain, and from there, that signal is sent to the fusiform part of the brain. This part of the brain is specifically responsible for facial recognition, which allows you to not only recognize people, but also tell people apart. The fusiform part of the brain then sends a signal to the amygdala, and based on the signal that the amygdala gets, it will release specific chemicals depending on how you perceive this person. These chemicals are essentially the precursor to emotions, and help your brain understand how you love and how you care about someone, and who you love and who you care about. Now, for people with Capgras delusion, their brain varies, because the fusiform part of their brain is not sending a strong enough signal to the amygdala, essentially meaning you can recognize somebody's face, but you're not getting the chemical reaction allowing you to essentially feel the emotions you're supposed to feel when seeing and thinking about that person. That lack of chemical release makes this person seem foreign or alien, or like something is missing, which is where the delusion comes into play, that this person must not be the real person that I know and love. This must be an imposter. This must be a clone. This must be a fake. And that is essentially how we understand how this delusion comes to be. And while we may understand how it happens, it doesn't make it any less terrifying or upsetting. If any of you watching this have experienced a family member with Alzheimer's, then you kind of know what I'm talking about. How upsetting and how scary it is to see somebody that you've known all of your life simply not remember you anymore, or to even not like you anymore. Growing up, one of my grandmothers actually had Alzheimer's, and during the later stages of it, she not only forgot who my sister was, who was living with her at the time, she also began to resent my sister for seemingly no reason. I can't imagine how that would feel to have not only your grandmother forget you, but begin to hate you and openly cuss you out and disrespect you. Of course, you have to understand that that's not them, that that's the disease, but it still hurts, and it's disheartening to see the deterioration of a loved one. Obviously, Alzheimer's and schizophrenia as well are terrifying and upsetting diseases, but this video is specifically focused on unheard of and obscure diseases, which is why I didn't outright mention them. Focusing back on Capgras delusion, not only do people suffering from this believe that someone that they love or know may be replaced by some sort of clone, but depending on the severity of their condition, what they do about this belief could range drastically. For example, the person experiencing this delusion may refuse to talk to that person altogether, as they do not believe that that's actually their loved one. In other cases, the person experiencing these delusions may actually physically assault or attack these people, as they believe that they have done something negative with their loved one and replace them, and they want to find answers. And in most cases, people refuse to believe any evidence to prove that they are not an imposter. And some people even become obsessed with exposing this imposter, going to almost any lengths to expose the true reality, which is obviously just a delusion. It's for this reason that I wanted to save this condition for the end of the list, because I believe on this list it's definitely the most terrifying and upsetting. And as of right now, there is little known, no cure, and not even treatment available for this delusion. Mental health is no joke, and in this video we discussed some truly terrifying and obscure mental health conditions. And I hope that more research will be conducted to help treat people with these conditions. Serial killers from every state in the United States of America. Alabama. Thomas Whisenhant. Thomas Warren Whisenhant was born and committed his crimes in Alabama. He was born on January 29th, 1947, and was convicted for the murders of 3 women between 1976 and 1977. He abducted, assaulted, and murdered these victims and then mutilated their bodies. Whisenhant was arrested in 1977 after being caught in the act of disposing of a victim's body. He was convicted and then sentenced to death in 1978, and despite multiple attempts to appeal this decision, he was executed via lethal injection on May 27th, 2010. Gruesome start to this video, and it doesn't get much better. Also, it's just wild to me that someone could be on death row for 32 years. Moving on. Alaska. Robert Hansen. Robert Christian Bose Hansen was born on February 15th, 1939 in Iowa, but later moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he lived a life of crime. Hansen was also known as the Butcher Baker for reasons we'll get into, and this individual was seriously twisted. He was an active serial killer in Alaska from 1972 to 1983, a total of 11 years, and unfortunately in that time assaulted and murdered 17 women, or I should say at least 17 murders and assaults. It is alleged that he has up to 37 kills and up to over 31 assaults as well. One of his methods of killing these women would be abducting them and then releasing them into the wilderness, where he would then hunt them for sport using guns and even hunting knives, which obviously plays in the name of the Butcher Baker. And the baker part comes from the fact that he actually owned a successful bakery. Hansen was caught after all of these years when one of his victims victims who got away led police directly to him. Once caught, he confessed and was sentenced to 461 years in prison without possibility of parole. This monster died in prison on August 21st, 2014. Arizona, Mark Godot. Mark Godot was born on September 6, 1964 in Phoenix, Arizona. Although his time active was only a mere 10 months, the level of terror he was able to bring to the Phoenix metro area was almost unbelievable. Mark Godot, also known as the Baseline Killer, was a serial killer, kidnapper, thief, and assaulter. In this 10-month spree from 2005 to 2006, not only did he commit 9 murders, but has also committed 84 other felony charges. Mark Godot was a seriously bad guy, and in 2006 was sentenced to multiple death sentences, and now he currently awaits execution on death row. According to available data, he was only active as a serial killer and serial assaultist for the 10 months that it claims, although I find it hard to believe that Mark was simply a great dude before this time frame. One reason I believe this is because one of the felonies that he committed, mind you, one of the total 93, is a crime that involves him robbing and assaulting a 12-year-old girl at gunpoint. Scum. Moving on. Arkansas. Ronald Gene Simmons. No, not Gene Simmons, the guy your dad thinks is really cool, the guy that your dad paints his face like, the guy that your dad gets too drunk listening to and hits you. That's Gene Simmons. This is Ronald Gene Simmons. Back on a serious note, Ronald Gene Simmons was a mass murderer who killed 16 people, including 14 family members. Almost as if he was competing with Mark Godot, who committed 9 murders in 10 months, Ronald Gene Simmons committed 16 murders in only 7 days. In Arkansas during December 1987. Ronald G. Simmons was born on July 15, 1940. Simmons served in the military before moving to Arkansas, and on December 22nd to 28th in 1987, he methodically murdered his family members at his home and then later killed 2 other people and injured 4 more in a nearby town. He was arrested without resistance and was convicted of the murder. Simmons was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection on June 25th, 1990. Gene Simmons from the band Kiss wanted to rock and roll all night and party every day. Ronald Gene Simmons from Arkansas wanted to kill people. California. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, is likely one of the most infamous names on this list. Strangely, I have never covered him on the channel, even though I've made numerous videos about serial killers. Ramirez was born on February 29th, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, but moved to California at the age of 22. Ramirez's crimes were heavily influenced by his troubled childhood, and he even had a cousin who taught him military skills that Ramirez ended up later using during his killing spree. That killing spree and honestly crime spree, which also included assaults and burglaries, took place in the greater Los Angeles area from 1984 to 1985. During this time, he committed numerous heinous crimes such as home invasions, murders, and assaults. His crime spree, marked by extreme violence and satanic rituals, created widespread fear throughout the LA area. And fortunately, he was caught on August 31st, 1985, where he was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and remained on death row until he died of cancer on June 7th, 2013. Colorado. Scott Lee Kimball. Scott Lee Kimball was a former FBI informant who was convicted of murdering at least 4 people between 2003 and 2004 while working with the FBI. Kimball was born on September 21st, 1966 in Boulder, Colorado. Kimball was a skilled forager who ran a legitimate business buying and selling organic beef, but primarily used his business as a vessel to enrich himself by passing on bad checks and other forged documents. This is relevant because Kimball would forge documents of his murder victims to make it appear as if they were still alive after they were already dead. Kimball exploited his informant status to evade suspicion and continued his crimes until inconsistencies caught up to him and he was arrested. Not only did he expose flaws in the FBI's informant program, but he was also sentenced to 70 years in prison, where he currently stays today. Oh, and if you're curious who the victims were, it was his uncle, his stepdaughter, and 2 of the girlfriends of inmates. This is almost exactly what I meant when I said that I don't believe someone who was an active serial killer was just a good person before their killing spree. This is a great example of that. Connecticut. Michael Ross. Michael Bruce Ross was born on July 26, 1959 in Connecticut. Ross was also known as the Roadside Strangler and the Eggman, whatever that means. Between 1981 and 1984, he murdered and assaulted 8 young women in New York and Connecticut. According to people that knew him growing up, he exhibited antisocial behavior from a very young age. He was sentenced to death for his crimes in 1987 and was executed via lethal injection in 2005. A fun fact about Michael Ross is that he was the last person to be executed in Connecticut before they abolished capital punishment in 2012. Delaware, Stephen Pennell. Stephen Brian Pennell, also known as the Route 40 Killer, was born on November 22, 1957. Interestingly, Pennell is Delaware's only known serial killer in modern history. Good job, Delaware. But unfortunately, that doesn't make his situation any better. Pennell was convicted of the murder and assault of 2 women and was suspected of 3 others. As the name suggests, he abducted most of his victims on Route 40. Pennell was sentenced to death and executed via lethal injection in 1992, making him the first person executed in Delaware in over 46 years. Florida. Eileen Wuornos. I've actually covered Eileen on the channel before, and her story is really quite interesting. Not only was she a female serial killer, but she was a female sex worker who targeted her male client. From 1989 to 1990, while she was working as a prostitute along the highways of Florida, Eileen killed and robbed 7 of her male clients. When caught, she claimed that she was simply defending herself from assault, but that story didn't quite work. Wuornos was arrested in 1991 and convicted of 6 murders and was executed via lethal injection in 2002. Fun fact about Eileen is that there's actually a movie made about her story called Monster, which released in 2003. Georgia. Wayne Williams. Williams, also known as the Atlanta Monster, the Atlanta Boogeyman, and the Atlanta Child Killer, was born on May 27, 1958. Wayne was only ever convicted of 2 murders, those being the murders of 2 adult men. But what's peculiar is the fact that he is heavily suspected of being responsible for the murder of 24 children. From 1979 to 1981, there was a spree of child murders in Atlanta known as the Atlanta Child Murders. I find it quite interesting that there's enough evidence to heavily suspect Wayne of being responsible for a very specific number of these murders, but not enough evidence to convict him. I guess it's fortunate that he was at least convicted of these 2 adult murders, but I'm sure his story would be much different if he was convicted of at least some of the child murders he was suspected of committing. Hawaii. Randall Saito. Randall Saito is admittedly not a serial killer, but he is still a killer. Saito randomly and brutally killed a woman at Ala Moana Center in 1979, and since then has been spending time in a mental institution as he was acquitted of this murder due to insanity. That's upsetting and scary. What else is scary is the fact that he escaped the mental hospital in 2017. He walked out of the facility, took a taxi to the airport, and flew to California using a fake name. Fortunately, Saito was caught days later and was charged an additional 5 years for the escape, but his escape definitely raised questions about the security lapses at the hospital. Like, I know Hawaii is laid back and chill, but it boggles my mind that in 2017, not 1987, in 2017, he just walked out, took a taxi, and took a flight with a fake name. Wild. Idaho. Paul Ezra Rhodes. Paul is one of your more or less cookie-cutter serial killers. He went on a killing spree, killed young women, was convicted of some of the murders, was suspected of more, and was executed via lethal injection. Like everyone on this list, this dude was horrible and disgusting. Illinois. John Wayne Gacy. If you're the type of person to be watching this video, then you're probably the type of person who knows who John Wayne Gacy is. He is one of the most infamous American serial killers and is widely known for his assault, torture, and murder of at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy's story is long and well documented, and I will only be giving a brief overview in this video, but if you're interested, there's a lot of documentaries. Gacy famously lived a double life, as he was seen as a pillar of the community by throwing events for the neighborhood. He was a manager at KFC and then started a construction business after spending some time in jail. Gacy was known as the Killer Clown because during his community events, he would typically dress up as a clown to entertain his neighbors. Although, unfortunately, for some of his victims, he would also dress up as the clown and assault and murder them. Gacy's story is extremely disturbing and was ultimately caught when bodies were discovered underneath his floor in his basement. Gacy was arrested on December 21st, 1978. He was then sentenced to death in 1980 and executed via, you guessed it, lethal injection in 1994. If a clown ever asks you if you want to try getting out of handcuffs, don't do it. Indiana. Herb Baumeister. Baumeister is a serial killer from Indiana and was active from the 1980s to the 1990s. He is suspected to have murdered at least 11 men and possibly all the way up to over 25 men. Due to the fact that there was no trial, this is all suspected, which is something we'll get into, but it's pretty certain. Why I say that is because human remains were found on Baumeister's property. Not only were the remains of 11 men found on the property, but there was also over 10,000 bone fragments scattered across the grounds of his farm. It is believed that Baumeister would lure victims into his home, specifically gay men, where he would then assault them and then kill them before burying their bodies. Once the police caught on and began looking for Baumeister, he had already escaped to Canada, where he took his own life in a national park before police could ever catch up to him. And for that reason, he was never convicted and never sentenced. But I think he knew what he had coming. Iowa. Earl Nelson. Earl Nelson is one of the oldest entries on this list so far, being born on May 12th, 1897 in California. Earl Nelson was also known as the Gorilla Man or the Dark Strangler. He was a serial killer, a assaultist, and a necrophile, and was also considered to be the first known serial assault murderer in the 20th century. He committed over 22 murders and also 22 separate attacks all across the west coast of the United States, including primarily Iowa. Nelson targeted landladies and their daughters and would gain entry to their homes by posing as a prospective tenant. He would then strangle the victims and do extremely unspeakable things. Nelson was caught in Canada, of all places, in 1927 and was executed by hanging, not lethal injection. So there you go, something new. Kansas. Dennis Rader. Okay, so this guy is wild. Everybody on this list is a complete lunatic, but this one in particular, I just finished watching a documentary about him. He was known as the BTK killer, which is actually an acronym for his routine, I guess you could say. He would bind, torture, and then kill his victims. And that's how he referred to himself as well. He was active in Wichita, Kansas from 1974 until 1991, a huge gap. What's even crazier is that he wasn't even caught until 2005 when he was arrested and pled guilty to all of the murders. What's potentially even crazier than his time active as a killer, or the large gap after his active period where he was just still free, is the fact that he would also, during his time active, would taunt the media outlets and police by leaving detailed messages describing his crimes. The only reason he was ever even caught is because in 2004, after a 13-year hiatus, he decided it was a good time to start rewriting letters and begin taunting the police again, when at this point, technology was advanced and they weren't playing around, and they caught him shortly after in the following year, and he was arrested, like I mentioned, in 2005. He's currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kentucky. Donald Harvey. This monster is a little bit different than some of the other monsters on this list. Harvey was a killer who claimed to have 87 murders, but was only confirmed to have 37. Still a ludicrous amount. He was active in Ohio, Kentucky between 1970 and 1987, a 17-year span. He gave himself the name the Angel of Death, and it'll all make sense in a second. Harvey was a healthcare worker and said that he started killing his patients to simply put them out of their misery, but said he eventually grew to enjoy killing his patients. Harvey would typically kill his victims by poisoning them with cyanide or suffocating them with a pillow. How Harvey was caught after doing this for so long, 17 years, is because the last victim he ever killed was a man who was on life support for several months after a motorcycle accident. His autopsy revealed the large amount of cyanide in his system, and then people began to grow suspicious, specifically of Harvey. They became extremely suspicious of him when they learned that he was forced to resign from a previous job in a Cincinnati hospital when he was caught stealing body parts for an occult ritual. Wild that he was even able to continue working in healthcare at all. Harvey lived in prison from 1987 all the way up until 2017 when he was found in his cell severely beaten and then later succumbed to his injuries and died in prison. It's crazy to me that someone working in healthcare with a very strange and peculiar history is able to kill at least 37 people over 17 years and not get caught for so long. We're not even halfway done this video yet, and we've heard some disgusting and deplorable stories. And I'm sorry to inform you, it doesn't get much better. So I did want to take just a quick breather before we got back into it. Okay, if you currently make YouTube videos, I want you to watch this. And if you don't, just skip to this timestamp. I get a ton of questions about how I make my videos, what I use to animate, what I use to illustrate, how I grew on YouTube, and everything of the sort. And my friend, Internet Anarchist, also had a lot of similar questions as well too. Him and I both had very fortunate experiences growing on YouTube, and it wasn't an accident or luck at all. It's my belief that success is caused by three things, not just on YouTube, but in anything: knowledge, experience, and immersion. Knowledge meaning having the right knowledge to know what to do and where to go. Experience meaning actually putting that knowledge into practice, testing it out, and learning for yourself with the proper guidance to avoid major mistakes. And immersion. Immersion meaning being surrounded by like-minded individuals that are on the same path as you, that you can compare notes with and relate to.
A big problem that we've noticed in the YouTube community right now is there is a lot of people trying to sell information to brand new YouTubers who don't have a budget and don't even know any better. So they'll fall for every trick in the book, and it's extremely disheartening. Internet Anarchist and I both realized that there was something that we could do, and we did it. That's why for any of my subscribers who have a YouTube channel that are wanting to actually grow and take YouTube seriously, I would love to invite you to our new school community called 1 of 10 Community. This is a completely free community. It's always free and will forever be free. It currently includes myself, Internet Anarchist, other huge YouTubers, and over 1,400 other small creators that are looking to grow their channel and are working every day to get better and providing each other feedback and support. My goal with this group is to provide small and upcoming YouTubers the absolute best opportunity to be able to grow quickly in a way that's not a scam. Like I said, there's a lot of predators on YouTube, and not that kind of predator, that are looking to prey upon small YouTubers who have the dream of growing but don't have the knowledge of making it happen. And unfortunately, these people are typically easily fooled by fake plaques and fake screenshots, and they are sold expensive courses that don't help them. That's why me and Internet Anarchist made something that was better than these paid courses, and it's absolutely free. So before we get back into the killing spree, if you are a YouTuber that follows me and you want to grow more on YouTube, please, I would love you to join 1 of 10 Community. The link's in the description. It's a completely free school community. Make an account and join a network of a ton of YouTubers like yourself who are just trying to grow and make their dreams come true. Okay, back into the void. Louisiana. Derek Todd Lee. Lee was born on November 5th, 1968, and was from St. Francisville in Louisiana. He is also known as the Baton Rouge serial killer and is known for his killing spree from 1998 all the way up to 2003, where during this time, he terrorized Baton Rouge and surrounding areas by committing at least 7 murders of, you guessed it, women. Before his murders, he was a great guy, right? No, not at all. Before his murder charges, Lee was actually arrested for stalking women and watching them in their own home. In an interesting twist, despite this previous arrest, during the search for this serial killer, the police overlooked him because they assumed the serial killer was white. However, Lee was eventually linked to all of these murders of these women in Louisiana via DNA tests, and in 2004, he was put on trial and was sentenced to death. Lee did not end up being killed via lethal injection because he actually died of heart disease in the hospital while on death row at the ripe old age of 47. Maine. James Hicks. Hicks is the only known serial killer from the state of Maine, and information on him was not easy to find. But the long and short of the story is, in 1977, his wife magically disappeared, which caused suspicion, but not that much suspicion because Hicks was not arrested until 1983 and convicted a year later in 1984. Before this arrest, another woman went missing who was last seen at a bar with Hicks. He was never arrested for this disappearance because there was never enough evidence to connect him to it. But after he was suspected of his wife's disappearance 6 years later, they tied the two together. For both of these disappearances, he was only sentenced to 10 years and only served 6 of them and was released from prison in 1990. Once he was released, he met another woman, started a life with her, moved in with her, and 6 years later, murdered her. He was suspected in her disappearance, but Hicks was never charged with her death either because of a lack of evidence. This guy was slimy. The only reason that Hicks was caught is because he was in Texas holding a gun to a 67-year-old woman's head, forcing her to sign over the title of her car to him and then write a note you would write to your loved ones telling them you won't be around, if you get my drift. He planned to drug and drown the woman to make it look like she did it, but this woman somehow escaped and Hicks was caught for this act, sentenced to 55 years, and during this time confessed to the 3 other murders he committed and actually led the Maine authorities directly to the sites where he buried these bodies. But yeah, Maine's only serial killer was a disgusting guy who got way too lucky for way too long. Maryland. Joe Matheny. Matheny is a hilarious name, specifically for this dude, because he looks like he enjoys meth-eny. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and claimed to have killed 13 people, but was only ever convicted of 2 of these murders. Research later confirmed 3 additional victims through matching his confessions to evidence. So he was convicted of 2, confirmed 5, and claims up to 13. He specifically preyed on homeless men and prostitutes, luring them in with the promise of food and drugs, and actually would just give them death. Notably, Matheny dismembered some of his victims and even disposed of their remains at a meat stand where he worked. He was arrested in 1996, convicted of multiple murders, and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And in 2017, he was found dead in his cell. So that's him. Massachusetts. Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo, also known as the Boston Strangler, I think the third or fourth strangler on this list so far, is a serial killer who confessed to the murder of at least 13 women in the Boston area between 1962 and 1964. DeSalvo would gain entry to his victims' homes by posing as a handyman. He, not shockingly, would strangle his victims to death. Very interestingly, DeSalvo was never convicted for any of these murders, but was imprisoned for other crimes. In 1973, in prison, he was actually murdered due to an ongoing debate that had taken place in the prison about his involvement with the Boston Strangler cases. So you could say justice was served, but not in the traditional sense. Michigan. Carl Eugene Watts. Watts was born in 1953 in Texas and might have the highest kill count on this list so far. Not that that's an accomplishment at all. It is just a morbid fact. Watts was nicknamed Coral and was dubbed by media outlets the Sunday morning slasher, who murdered an insane amount of women over an 8-year period. He is also suspected of being the most prolific serial killer in all United States history. At the absolute minimum, Watts is responsible for 14 murders, but at the absolute most, he is responsible for over 100 murders. Keep in mind, this was only through an 8-year period. Wild. All of which of these murders took place within Michigan. Watts would stalk his victims, break into their homes, and then kill them using various methods, such as stabbing or strangulation. Watts was arrested in 1982 and was sentenced to life in prison, where he died of cancer in 2007. Minnesota. Paul Michael Stefani. Stefani, also known as the Weepy Voice Killer, was a serial killer who murdered at least 3, you guessed it, women in Minnesota during the early 1980s. He gained his nickname from his tendency to call emergency services after committing his crimes in a sobbing, high-pitched voice. Stefani was caught in 1982 after 2 years of being active and later confessed to the murders. He was sentenced to 40 years of prison and, like some others on this list, died of cancer in prison. Mississippi. Glenn Edward Rogers. Glenn lived a very transient lifestyle and for that reason killed in many different states and lived in many different states. But for the purpose of this video, we're focusing on Mississippi. Glenn is convicted of 2 murders, suspected of 3 more, and claims over 70 total. Glenn was active from 1993 to 1995. And during that time, he worked as a handyman and also, you guessed it, killed women. You can probably guess how as well. Something interesting about this guy though is the fact that he actually was on the FBI top 10 most wanted fugitives list and was caught after a nationwide manhunt. Currently, he's on death row in Florida. Missouri. Robert Burdella. Burdella was a serial killer from Kansas City who was known as the Kansas City Butcher, or more ominously, the Collector. He was active during the 1980s, and during this time, he killed at least 6 young men. Yeah, different. He would lure his victims, who were often young men, into his home where he would subject them to prolonged periods of captivity and torture, typically including assault, and always ended in murder. After being active for 3 years, Burdella was caught in 1988 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He ended up dying in jail 4 years later in 1992 at the age of 43. Montana. Nathaniel Bar Jonah. This case specifically is quite upsetting and disturbing. Jonah was primarily a child assaulter and was only a suspected serial killer and cannibal. And although he has 0 confirmed murders, he has 5 suspected murders and 10 plus confirmed victims that are children that survived. He was active from 1964 all the way until 1999, which is just heartbreaking. At least in 1999, he was apprehended and convicted with assault, kidnapping, attempted murder, and child assaultation, and was given 130 years in prison at the Montana State Prison, where he died in 2008. Gross. Nebraska. Charles Starkweather. This case has one of the fastest timelines on this list. Starkweather was a serial killer who, along with his girlfriend, killed 11 people in the span of only 2 months. The rampage began with the murder of a gas station attendant, and this snowballed into a series of robberies and killings, including the murder of some of his girlfriend's family members. After this 2-month killing spree, the pair was caught in Wyoming after a high-speed chase. Starkweather was sentenced to death and was executed a year later after being caught in 1959. So let me break it down for you. This guy was 18 years old, decides to go on a 2-month killing spree, and is executed via the electric chair only 6 months after being put on death row. He died at the age of 20. That is quick justice. His girlfriend, on the other hand, who was his accomplice, was only sentenced to 17 years in jail. Wild. Nevada. Carol Cole. This is the first man I've ever seen named Carol, so that's something. Cole was a serial killer who was convicted of strangling 2 women in Nevada and murdering 3 others in Texas. This is pretty typical. What's not as typical is that he is believed to be linked to at least 30 other murders between 1947 and 1980. A huge 33-year gap of being an active, potential killer. Wild. Cole was sentenced to death for his crimes, and for his last meal he had jumbo fried shrimp, french fries, and salad with French dressing and Boston clam chowder. And the next day he was executed via lethal injection on December 6th, 1985. New Hampshire. Sheila LaBear. In 2008, Sheila was convicted for murdering 2 of her boyfriends in 2005 and 2006, respectively. And she claims that she did this because she was sent by God as an avenging angel to Earth to punish pedophiles, which in her mind included her 2 boyfriends, whose bodies were found on her huge farm. Now you might be like, all right, I can get behind this a bit, I get it. Here's another twist. According to Brad Bailey, a defense attorney who represented her, he says, and I quote, "There seemed to be no basis whatsoever in reality to suggest or claim any of her victims were pedophiles or engaged in any of these child abusing behaviors. None whatsoever." So yeah, not only did she murder people, but she also tried to ruin their name. Sheila typically met her victims by putting out personal ads looking for farmhands on her farm. Although she was only convicted of the murder of 2 men, she also admitted during her trial that she killed several others, but these were not confirmed. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. New Jersey. Richard Biegenwald. Biegenwald was active from 1958 all the way till 1983, and during this time, you guessed it, he murdered people. In 1983, he was convicted of 5 murders but was suspected of 8. An interesting fact is, after the serial killer died, his lawyer actually mentioned publicly that this criminal told his lawyer that he may have up to 100 victims, which is likely inflated, but the fact is this monster likely had many more victims than he was convicted for, which doesn't seem extremely uncommon for this list. Richard was actually on death row for a short amount of time, but it was overturned and he was resentenced to life in prison, where he still died in prison in 2008. New Mexico. David Parker Ray. Ray was a suspected torturer who is also known as the Toy Box Killer. This case is really interesting because he technically has 0 murders confirmed, but has 3 confirmed victims and possibly anywhere from 60 to 100 plus victims that he tortured and assaulted on his property in his toy box, which was basically a trailer beside his home, which is a movable, portable torture chamber that he had a large kidnapping and assault operation happening in there. Crazy. For the unthinkable amount of torture that he inflicted upon potentially hundreds of women, Ray was sentenced to 224 years in prison, where he unfortunately only served a few months because he died of a heart attack. Unfortunate he didn't serve more time. Not unfortunate that he died. Ray was a serious monster and is even quoted saying that he did nothing wrong to women. He only did what women wanted, and he got pleasure from their pleasure. And his assault on these women was, in his mind, him doing good for society. So he thought it'd be total sicko. New York. David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam or Mr. Monster, according to Wikipedia, was a serial killer who terrorized New York City in the summer of 1976 and 1977. Berkowitz, surprise, surprise, targeted young women and couples, shooting them in cold blood with a .44 caliber revolver. His crimes sparked a citywide manhunt for him, and he even left notes taunting the police, promising more crimes. Fortunately, Berkowitz was caught in 1977 and later confessed to all of his crimes, which were plentiful. He ended up murdering 6 people and wounding 11 more. He is currently in jail serving 6 life sentences as we speak. North Carolina. Henry Louis Wallace. Wallace may have one of the most odd nicknames on this list. He is known as the Charlotte Strangler, which is somewhat tame, but he's also known as the Taco Bell Strangler. This video is not a laughing matter, but that name is weird. I guess it's because he worked as a manager at Taco Bell in Charlotte. Wallace was a serial assaulter and murderer, targeting young African-American women, and over the course of a 4-year span, he victimized over 9 women. He was caught in March of 1994 and currently sits on death row awaiting execution. North Dakota. Eugene Butler. The story of Butler is unlike anything we've heard on this list so far. He is the only killer who was never convicted of his crimes so far on this list. Eugene Butler was born in 1849 in New York State, but all of his crimes took place and he actually died in North Dakota. But we'll get into that. From the years of 1900 to 1906 in Niagara, North Dakota, Butler murdered 6 teenage boys in his house and buried the bodies in his basement. Now, the twist of all this, Butler was actually committed to an insane asylum for unrelated charges where he died in 1913. The crazy part is the bodies that were buried in his house were not found until 1915, 2 years after Butler died in the insane asylum. Super weird. Ohio. Anthony Sowell. The story of Sowell is something we've heard numerous times on this list so far, so I'll keep it brief. He had a generic name. He was known as the Cleveland Strangler. He was active for 2 years, from 2007 till 2009. He murdered at least 11 women who he targeted, specifically women that were vulnerable. By that I mean women that were either dealing with addiction or homeless. And he was arrested in 2009 when one of his victims escaped and alerted authorities. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and was sentenced to death in 2011. Sowell died in 2021 due to an unspecified terminal illness. Oklahoma. Roger Dale Stafford. Stafford was a serial killer active from 1974 until 1978, and in this time he had 9 confirmed kills which he was evicted of, but potentially a lot more. Stafford started his killing spree by killing an assistant manager working at a McDonald's. After killing this manager, he robbed the McDonald's for over $1,300 and then continued on his spree. His next targets were a family that he flagged off the side of the highway, who he robbed and murdered the entire family. 3 weeks later, he robbed a sirloin stockade in Oklahoma City, and during this robbery murdered 6 employees, most of these victims being teenage staff members. 6 days after this restaurant massacre, Stafford was found and apprehended. Unsurprisingly, he was sentenced to death, and in 1995, he was executed via lethal injection. Oregon. Dayton Leroy Rogers. Dubbed the Molalla Forest Murderer due to the fact that he would dump the bodies of his victims in the Molalla Forest in Oregon. Rogers was a serial killer who was active for, once again, 4 years and targeted, once again, vulnerable women, specifically addicts, sex workers, and the like. Rogers notably was sentenced to death 4 times, with each sentence being overturned by the Oregon Supreme Court. And in 2021, his death sentence was overturned again due to new laws, and in 2022, his sentence was commuted to life without parole. Pennsylvania. Gary Heidnik. Gary was a serial kidnapper, torturer, and murderer, and fortunately was only active for just over a year. During this year, he kidnapped 6 women, 2 of which died from his torture, and the other 4 fortunately survived. One of these surviving victims was actually able to go to the authorities and inform them about Gary's horrendous actions. Gary was quickly arrested in March 1987 and convicted of multiple charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, assault, aggravated assault, and more. He was sentenced to death, and in 1999, he was executed via lethal injection and was one of the last people to ever be executed in the state of Pennsylvania. Rhode Island. Craig Price. I believe Price is the youngest killer we've seen on this list, with his first murders taking place when he was only 13 years old. From the ages of 13 to 15, he committed 4 murders of women in his neighborhood, and he was arrested at the age of 15. Due to his age, he was actually initially set for release at the age of 21, which to me is mind-boggling for someone who murdered 4 people, no matter their age. But due to ongoing violent behavior within prison, he was sentenced to a much longer time and actually tried as an adult. He will likely never see the light of day. South Carolina. Donald Henry Gaskins. Gaskins was born in 1933 and unfortunately had a huge span of crimes in his lifetime, starting in 1953 and going all the way until 1982. During this time, he had 15 confirmed kills and later on claimed he had up to 110. He killed hitchhikers, acquaintances, and more, and had a laundry list of charges under his belt. A couple notable things about Gaskins is the fact that when he was arrested, he was actually sentenced to death, but then was later commuted to only life in prison, but then later killed someone in prison using a bomb, and because of that was once again sentenced to death and later executed in prison in 1991. Dude literally got off death row and got right back on with a bomb somehow. Crazy. South Dakota. Robert Leroy Anderson. Anderson was your run-of-the-mill creep. He was an assaulter and killer. He has at least 2 confirmed victims across multiple states in the US, primarily South Dakota, and would typically lure victims by posing as a photographer wanting to take pictures of people. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1984, and in 2002 died in prison while waiting for execution. Tennessee. Paul Dennis Reed. Reed was also known as the fast food killer, specifically because he targeted fast food workers working the late shift. He would rob, assault, and murder these employees, and was sentenced to death for the murder of 7 fast food employees in the Nashville metropolitan area. Reed was sentenced to death and died in 2013 while waiting for execution. Fast food employees really deal with too much. Texas. Dean Corll. Corll, also known as the Candyman or the Pied Piper, was a mass serial killer, serial assaulter, and serial torturer, and was a member of the Houston mass murders, which at the time of its discovery were considered the worst example of serial murders in the entire history of the US. Corll was known as the Candyman because his family had previously owned and operated a candy company in Houston, and he personally had been known to give free candy to local children, which is the most stereotypical and scary thing I've ever heard. and he was known as the Pied Piper because his murders would typically start with him luring people, typically with the offer of a ride or for an invite to a party. From the years of 1970 to 1973, Corll and his 2 accomplices murdered at the very least 28 victims. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how much time Corll got because he was never sentenced. He was actually murdered by one of his accomplices before he was ever caught, which may be good or bad news depending on how you look at it. After this accomplice killed Corll, they called the police and promptly confessed to all of the murders, leading to the discovery that shocked Houston to its core: Utah. Ted Bundy. If you're watching this video, you definitely know who Ted Bundy is, and I probably don't need to tell his story. But as a quick recap, he has an unknown amount of victims, but it's likely believed to be in the range of 30 to 36. He was active during the 1970s and was executed in 1989. If you want more details, watch this video. I go in extreme depth about his story. He is a great example of why you should never judge a book by its cover. Vermont. Israel Keyes. Keyes is a very strange serial killer. He was extremely meticulous in his planning, but extremely random in his selection of victims. He murdered at least 11 people across multiple states, including Vermont, between 2001 and 2012. And Keyes even had a specific method of burying what he called kill kits in different locations so he could commit murder at any time. He was captured in 2012 and didn't continue living, I'm not going to say unalive because that's the dumbest thing ever, while awaiting trial, leaving so many questions unanswered about his motives and the true extent of his crimes. Virginia. Timothy Wilson Spencer. Spencer was active from 1994 to 1998, once again, 4 years, committed 5 assaults and murders, and was sentenced to death by electric chair, not lethal injection. Washington. Gary Ridgway. Ridgway was active from 1982 to 1988, confirmed, and was possibly active as recent as 2001. He was arrested on November 30th in 2001 and confessed to murdering at least 71 women, many of whom were vulnerable women, like we explained before. This unfathomable kill count made him one of the most prolific serial killers in US history. In 2001, he pled guilty to 48 counts of murder to avoid the death penalty and is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It's crazy how someone with 71 murders can actually avoid the death sentence. Whether you're for it or against it, it's crazy how somebody with 2 murders can get the death penalty, but someone with 48 confirmed at the very least can get around it. West Virginia. Harry Powers. Powers was an active killer in the 1930s and was particularly evil because he preyed upon vulnerable, lonely widows who had just lost a loved one. He would meet them on classified ads in the newspaper and would murder them for their money. During his time active, he killed at least 5 women and 3 children before being caught. He was tried, convicted, and executed in 1932. Once his story gained national attention, it was considered to be a contributing factor to people's fear of meeting people through classified ads in the newspaper. Wisconsin. Jeffrey Dahmer. Much like Ted Bundy, this demented monster likely needs no introduction. His story has been told many times, and his infamy is widespread. If you want an in-depth review, here's a video where I discuss his story at length. In short, he murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He primarily targeted black young men, luring them into his home with the promises of sex or money. He did unspeakable things to his victims' bodies and was arrested in 1991 and sentenced to 16 life terms in prison, but was only killed a few years later in 1994 by a fellow inmate. Wyoming. Dale Wayne Eaton. Eaton was a suspect in a string of murders known as the Great Basin Murders, which took place from 1983 to 1997, where over 9 victims, most of them being teenage females, were assaulted and killed. Eaton was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to life in prison. And ladies and gentlemen, there we have it. One serial killer from every single state. There was honestly a surprising amount of similarities across the board. Notably, at least to me, were the fact that a lot of these murderers were able to get away for 4 years. That was a pretty common trend. And every killer has some weird nickname, like the something strangler, which is the most common. It's like being a rapper and having Lil in your name. And a very unfortunate and upsetting trend is that almost every serial killer was also a serial assaultist, except for one guy. One guy, or maybe 2 of these guys, was a robber that murdered people. Not necessarily much better.
The craziest execution methods from around the world. When you talk about executions, everybody seems to talk about what their last meal would be, but nobody seems to talk about what their execution method would be. And in this video, I'm going to show you some truly obscure and brutal execution methods from around the world that you would never want to experience. And as always, this video only gets more brutal as the list goes on. Italy. Falling. Italy has a long and rich history, and for that reason, I'm gonna give a few examples of how they used this one torture method throughout different parts of its history in different ways. Let's start in pre-Roman Sardinia. Imagine you're just an old person living in your little hut, maybe on the coast of the island that you reside on. You realize that you're getting up there in age and realize that soon the ritual was going to happen. One day, a group of young men come into your house and tell you it's ritual time, and you prepare for what's about to happen, as you've seen it happen to other men your age. You're first given a mysterious neurotoxic drink. You are then carried to a nearby cliff by these young men. But these young men aren't just on this cliffside to watch the sunset with you. They are raising you above their head Lion King style and throwing you off a cliff. That's right. The first execution method we're talking about is falling. Definitely one of the most simple entries on this list, but trust me, the implications are pretty wild. In this first example I gave in pre-Roman Sardinia, people were literally just executing the elderly. Like, this was a common ritual. During this time, if you were an elderly person who was unable to support themselves, you were ritually killed. And this was just an accepted practice in pre-Roman Sardinia. And as I described, how this would typically go is they would get the old person intoxicated through a neurotoxic plant that was known as the sardonic herb. Regardless, once they get their elderly victim nice and high, they will take them somewhere nice and high. And at that point, they have one of two options. They are either dropped from a high height or beaten to death and then dropped from a high height. And that's just the Sardinian version of an old folks home. There's really not too much more to say about literally falling off a cliff, but it is an interesting execution method, and I wanted to add it specifically for this reason because in Italy, they were just doing it differently. This wasn't the only time that falling was used as an execution method in modern day Italy. For example, during the Roman Empire, an emperor by the name of Tiberius was known to also use this method, also for an interesting reason. Emperors would execute people for a plethora of reasons, but Tiberius would specifically execute boys that he was no longer enjoying physically, if you get my drift. Once Tiberius felt that he had his fun with these boys, he would have them thrown off a cliff while he watched. But he was compassionate because he didn't have these boys thrown onto rock, he had these boys thrown into water. Obviously, being thrown into water could still lead to instant death or death by drowning, but there is a chance that these boys could survive. But don't worry, Tiberius definitely thought of this. So when he had these boys thrown off a cliff into the water, he had men in boats below waiting for these boys to land in the water where they could then break their bones with the oars if needed. So yeah, falling is definitely one of the most prehistoric and simple methods of execution, but in Italy, back in the day, they were using it for some very strange reasons. But let's move on. The United States. The upright jerker. I realize this execution method sounds like your nighttime routine, but trust me, it's not nearly as fun. You see, in the 19th and early 20th century, the United States was doing a lot of hangings. And as society began to get more civilized, they thought, maybe these public hangings everybody loves is a bit barbaric. We should definitely keep executing people in public, but let's do it differently. And the product of that thought was the upright jerker, which kind of sounds like a nickname you would give someone who sleepwalks and sleepwanks at the same time. Seriously though, where the upright jerker differed from the traditional hanging was as follows. Traditional hanging would take place on a gallows, typically high up with a trapdoor below the condemned person's feet. The executioner would open the trapdoor and the person would fall and the rope would snap their neck or quickly strangle them, with the weight of their body compressing their neck in the noose. During this time, there was a lot of high-profile botched hangings, which is why they decided to try something new, something that they thought would be more effective. The upright jerker differed from traditional hangings because instead of being dropped from a height onto your neck, you would start on the ground and actually be lifted up by your neck. This would happen with the same style of noose being connected to the victim's neck, although the rope would be connected to a series of pulleys that would be connected to weights. So when the executioner was ready, he would activate the system and the condemned person would be hoisted up into the air, typically instantly breaking their neck, and if not, similar to hanging, would slowly be strangulated to death. The name upright jerker comes from the victim obviously being upright and being shot into the air, but jerker refers to how the body would typically move after they would be flung into the air, because the pulley system would typically bounce the body up and down, jerking them. Definitely morbid. And an interesting take on hanging I haven't heard of until now. Sri Lanka. Crushing by elephant. I mean, you probably already get the idea, but I'm gonna give a bit more context because, believe it or not, there is some nuance to this. Unlike the very first example I talked about, this method was used on criminals, so we're at least off to a better start. How this execution method would work is, after the justice system of the time would do its thing, and then the person was then sentenced to death, they would then have them ready for the elephant execution. How this would look is the condemned person would be put on a pedestal, typically a smooth stone surface, and then they would bring in the elephants. But here's the thing, the elephant could go one of many ways. Depending on how trained the elephant was, they would either walk the elephant back and forth over top of the person until the elephant accidentally stepped on the vitals of this person, or if the elephant was more trained, the elephant would deliberately step on the person's limbs, torso, and even head to quickly execute the individual. Pretty simple, but extremely brutal. But these weren't the only ways that they would use elephants to their advantage. In some cases, they wouldn't even have the elephant step on the person at all, at least not at first. They wouldn't start with the person laying down. They would allow the elephant to grab the person by their trunk and throw them around. And then, once they were thrown to the ground, the elephant would then, do its little moonwalk. This method was used not only in Sri Lanka, but also in India and other parts of Asia for quite a long time, and was even popular up into the late 19th century, although in modern times it's no longer used. However, the terrifying stories still remain. And if you plan on becoming a time-traveling criminal, I definitely wouldn't recommend doing anything in Sri Lanka during the 17th, 18th, or 19th century, unless you want to get up close and personal with Dumbo. China. Execution vans. Okay, so this is the first modern method on the list, and surprise, surprise, is one of the only modern methods, because a lot of the modern methods now are humane as they can be, and most places don't even do executions anymore. But leave it to China to give us an interesting entry for this list. And while most countries around the globe have been decreasing or even entirely eliminating the amount of executions they're doing every year, China is actually raising those numbers and has a plethora of laws that if you break, you can be executed, which is for that reason why they have the execution van, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is literally a van that is kitted out to kill criminals. From the outside, the van appears to be a 24-person bus, with its windows covered and with minimal police markings. But on the inside of this bus, it almost resembles a hospital room, although nobody in this van is going to be healed. Typically, how it would work is once you end up on a Chinese death row, instead of going to a part of the prison where you'd be executed, you would be picked up by the van. And once in the van, you'd be strapped down to an operating style table and then injected with a lethal injection. And at that point, driven likely to the morgue. Truthfully, finding publicly available information on China's mobile execution chambers is a bit tough, although it's definitely not a secret. These execution vans have been in use since 2003 and are still in use to this day. Although technically this method is only lethal injection, I think the fact that China has systematized it to a point where they've made it a literal mobile execution chamber for maximum efficiency definitely earns it a spot on this list. Just imagine living in China and seeing this thing though. Like in your everyday life, when you see a hearse go by, you get kind of a feeling or a thought. But if you see an execution van go by, I can't imagine the literal aura of that thing. Can't be good. Spain, the garrote. All right, buckle up. Things are really taking a dark turn now. The garrote was used in the 1800s and the 1900s and was used not only in Spain, but also in Spanish colonies, like the Philippines. And interestingly, the garrote was seen as a more merciful form of execution compared to the going technique of death by burning, which I'll let you make your own opinion on once I explain the garrote. The garrote consists of a small seat for you to sit on and a wooden plank going up your spine. Once in the seat, you would have a metal loop wrapped around your neck. And directly behind your head on the wooden post that your spine is aligned with would be essentially a big screw. And what this screw would do was actually twofold, because as the executioner would turn the screw from behind your neck, a sharp piece of metal would slowly be pressing against the back of your neck. And with every turn, your neck would become crushed by the piece of metal literally securing your head to this post. And how this victim would die would vary. But the two most common methods were either one, having the person's brainstem literally explode due to the pressure from the spike going through the back of the neck, or if you were lucky, before you even got to that point, you were asphyxiated to death by the pressure on your neck through the metal loop. Regardless, the garrote is absolutely brutal. Just for a quick pop quiz, when do you think they stopped using this brutal device? The use was officially and finally abolished in 1978. Only 47 years ago. Chances are if you're watching this video, either your parents or possibly even yourself were alive during the time that this device was still in use. Some history isn't as far back as you think. Let's keep moving. Uzbekistan. Boiling alive. I'm going to preface this by saying that historically, boiling alive was used a lot in both England and China. But because we already talked about China and we're going to be speaking about England, I decided to pin this on Uzbekistan because they have the most recent recorded usage of this method. Now you might be asking yourself, what exactly is the method? And let me tell you. Death by boiling is when somebody boils not just water, but also animal fat, motor oil, cooking oil, or really any liquid of their choice, and then they would submerge their victim into this boiling liquid. And the result would be likely one of the most excruciating experiences humanly possible. And for that reason, it's on the list. Historically, Henry VIII made boiling the official execution method for anybody who committed murder via poisoning, as well as anybody who committed high treason. And during the 16th century in Japan, Japanese bandits were boiled alive as well. But in more modern times, specifically from 1991 all the way until 2016, Uzbekistan is alleged to have been boiling suspected terrorists on the regular. And this is kind of confirmed by a United States Department of State document from 2004, which confirmed that the Uzbekistan government had tortured 2 gang members, and their bodies were extensively bruised, burned, and reportedly submerged in boiling water as well, making that allegation a little bit more real. And since we're speaking about boiling people alive in the modern day, there's a documentary that came out in 2010 about sicarios, the Latin American gang. And during this documentary, during an interview with a sicario, the sicario claimed that the Mexican cartel would boil alive anybody found to be working for the police. And these people were boiled alive in oil until they were no longer alive. So even though in the modern day, no country has boiling alive on their menu of official execution methods, there are definitely places where it's still being done, which is a terrifying thought. Ancient Rome, penalty of the sack. Ancient Rome's got a lot of history, and interesting execution styles is part of that history. Now, truthfully, penalty of the sack kind of sounds like something you'd pay a dominatrix for. But in reality, it's just the translation of the original Latin word, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce because, well, you guys roast me. And similar to the very first execution method that we talked about, this method of execution was reserved only for a specific crime. That crime being parricide, or killing a member of your immediate family. So at least it wasn't used on, someone just who was old. It was at least used on a murderer, but still, the question remains, what is the punishment of the sack? Whose sack is being punished? How do they punish the sack? And don't worry, it's at least 100 times worse than any form of cock and ball torture you could imagine. Okay, jokes aside, penalty of the sack went as follows. Someone would kill their parents, they would get caught, they would get convicted, then they are awaiting execution. Execution day comes, and this is how it plays out. The criminal is first put into either a barrel or a large burlap sack. The person is then told to curl up into a ball, and the bag or barrel that they are in is then either filled with snakes, monkeys, dogs, or chickens. And at that point, the barrel or sack is sealed, and then you are thrown into the water. So not only are you panicking in this small confined space while you are slowly drowning, you're also in there with a wild animal. Which, first of all, what did the animal do? What did this chicken, snake, dog, what did they do? They didn't do anything. That's just friendly fire. Imagine just being a chicken and getting caught in the crossfire because this guy killed his parents. Regardless, in ancient Rome, drowning was simply not enough. That's wild. Medieval Europe, rat torture. This method was pretty widely spread across all of Europe during the medieval era, so I'm just doing the region, not even the country. They were all guilty. Rat torture is definitely one of the most famous and one of the most brutal methods of execution likely ever used. And for that reason, you may already be familiar with this method. So I'll keep it brief. This method was used on any range of criminals, and although the method was considered torture, it essentially had a 99.99% fatality rate. Here's how it would work. You would be walked into the execution chamber, the dungeon, the medieval places where people died, and you would be strapped down. Once strapped down, you would have a rat placed typically on your stomach. And on top of that rat, they would place a small cage firmly on top of your stomach, trapping the rat onto your body. And now you officially have a pet rat. But unfortunately, this isn't the end of the torture method, as once this cage was secured to your body, the executioner would begin to apply typically heat to the rat to make it uncomfortable and force it to try to find a way out of this cage. And of course, it can't get through the metal cage, however, it could possibly burrow down. And that's exactly what would happen. This rat would begin to burrow and eat and scratch and claw through the person's body, typically going directly into their intestines, causing an excruciating and brutal experience that would typically not instantly kill you, but cause a slow, excruciating, painful death in anywhere from a few hours to even a few days in some cases. This death was typically brought on by a loss of blood or disease. And it's really as simple as that. I can't think of many things more brutal than having rats forced to burrow through your body while you're still alive. And yet, there's still one final entry on this list. England, drawing and quartering. For the final entry on this list, I knew there was only one suitable entry, that being drawing and quartering. Primarily because it's not even a single execution method. It is a combination of 3 used sequentially. And they intentionally keep you alive during the initial, I guess not even executions, just torture methods until they ultimately kill you. Drawing and quartering was reserved specifically for traitors. And this method was supremely brutal because they wanted to set a very strong example that if you were a traitor, that the consequences were above all else. And interestingly, this method of execution was actually so brutal that they didn't even do it on women. They only did it on men. This rule was in place because, spoiler alert, the men would be naked during part of this execution, and they figured it would be too indecent to do that to women. So instead, women only got beheaded or burned at the stake, which, as brutal as those are, they seem like child's play compared to drawing and quartering. So let's say you commit treason in medieval England. What exactly happens? First, you are removed from your jail cell and dragged by horse from the prison to the gallows. At that point, you are put on the gallows and hung, but not fully. You are only hung until you are half dead. Once the executioner feels that you are sufficiently hung, you are cut down. Once you are cut down, you are literally disemboweled, with the executioner removing your organs out of your body. And then the executioner will set your organs on fire. At that point, you are then beheaded. And then once you are beheaded, all 4 of your limbs are attached to separate horses, and the horses pull your body apart. And that is the long and short of drawing and quartering. And there was kind of variations on how this kind of happened, but this was the head honcho of all of the techniques used. Initially, I actually planned on putting tearing apart by animals on the list because that alone is an extremely brutal method of execution. But once I learned about drawing and quartering, I realized that I had to save being torn apart by any animal for the method that included that, along with 3 other literal execution methods. It's probably one of the most brutal execution methods of all time, and was extremely popular during medieval times, and was only abolished in the 19th century, which isn't super recent, but not super long ago either.